Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Oppenheimer live streams. Today is going to be Tuesday, the 20th of April, 1954, the 7th day of hearings in the Oppenheimer Security Hearings case. So today we're going to have a few more witnesses testify on behalf of Oppenheimer, and it should be a pretty interesting time as always. So give me a few seconds to get things set up here, and then we'll get started. All right, so yeah, if you're joining us for the first time, just a few reminders. So first thing is that if you have any questions about what I'm covering, feel free to leave them in the chat and I will answer your questions and respond to your comments. And if you're watching this on playback, feel free to do the same in the comments section and I'll respond by text. Now, as I go through the transcript, I'm going to be swapping between various people in these slides, as you can see like this. And basically, the person who is being displayed at the moment is the person who is talking at the moment as I talk through these transcripts. So, yeah. One moment on that regard. Just need to reorganize these slides a little bit. Okay. So yeah, and then on the bottom left, that represents the people that are present in the room while this hearing is happening. And the person at the bottom in the center under the T, where there's no one there right now, but that's going to be the witness stand. So yeah, I think that's everything out of the way. So I think I'll get started. All right. First of all, I have a telegram from an individual named C.S. Kuntz, 4507 North Dover Street, Chicago, Illinois. His telegram to me said, quote, "Please wire date of Oppenheimer hearing as wished to testify, was employed under Dr. Oppenheimer 43 through 46, respectively," end quote. I am informed that Mr. Kuntz has indicated that he wishes to testify for, if you will allow me to put it that way, Dr. Oppenheimer. I pass it along for whatever value it may be to you. If you do not propose to call him, perhaps I should communicate and tell him that we will not need him as a witness. Can you answer that question now? Can I hear the spelling of the name? Kuntz. I don't recollect him. Obviously, he was someone who worked with you in the lab. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing it to our attention. Perhaps you would want to talk about this. As far as I now know, we certainly have no intention of calling him. Very well. The other thing I want to discuss is the question of the redirect examination of Dr. Oppenheimer. You will recall, I guess it was on Friday, we had a discussion of this, and because of the presence of witnesses, specifically including Mr. Lansdale and Dr. Glennon, I guess one of whom I think was already on his way, or who was in the city at the time, out of consideration for their problems, we said that we would hear them. You will recall, however, that I indicated that the board wished to proceed with the redirect examination of Dr. Oppenheimer at the conclusion of the cross-examination with these interruptions for convenience. The board feels very strongly that a good deal of confusion, at least in our minds, could be eliminated by getting back to Dr. Oppenheimer right away and seeking insofar as possible to have his testimony, redirect, and any recross examination not fragmented and interrupted. I understand that Mr. Kennan is here and at the moment is waiting to testify, and of course we will hear him. Perhaps I should ask if there are any other witnesses on hand this morning. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lilienthal is here from New York. Mr. Sumner Pike is here from Maine. Dr. Fermi is arriving at noontime from Chicago. Professor Zacharias is here from Boston. Dr. Conant has cabled over that at 2 o'clock this afternoon he had to make plans because of the complicated nature of his witness here. Professor Ramsey from Harvard is here. What our problem very simply has been is this. When we got the transcripts Friday afternoon, it was just physically not time over the weekend. I didn't get through more than a portion of one volume of the cross-examination myself, with the difficulties of trying to arrange for these witnesses and all the rest impinging, and also the problem of analyzing what had become quite a complicated record with the bringing in of the elaboration of various names and places and dates and recollections, and then the procedure that had been adopted of asking Dr. Oppenheimer questions on the basis of what he recalled in the past, and then producing documents, some of which had been taken from his own files on a classified basis and suddenly declassified. All this produced a very complicated and difficult record to analyze. It has been purely a problem of time. I don't want to ask Dr. Oppenheimer to testify until we really are prepared and he is thoroughly ready to do it. I want very much to cooperate with the board on this. I would think that today the calendar is really beyond our... It would sound so. I would suggest then that we proceed with the witnesses who are here or on their way here today and start tomorrow morning with Dr. Oppenheimer again. I want to ask about Dr. Conant. You started to mention him. Is he here in Washington? Yes, he is. He will be here today at 2 o'clock. We can talk over our problem during the lunch hour. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake there where I should have, here, let me rewind on that. It would sound so. I would suggest then that we proceed with the witnesses who are here or on their way here today and start tomorrow morning with Dr. Oppenheimer again. I want to ask about Dr. Conant. You started to mention him. Is he here in Washington? Yes, he is. He will be here today at 2 o'clock. We can talk over our problem during the lunch hour. All right. May I ask at this point only for an indication as to what is involved in time, because I think the board will probably call some witnesses, and they have to be alerted, I suppose, or should be, I'm sure. Could you give an indication of who are yet to come before the board as witnesses called by Dr. Oppenheimer? This is not for any purpose other than time. I understand. Yes, we have 10, I think, outside of those I mentioned today. General McCormick, Walter Whitman, Dr. Robbie, Dr. von Neumann, President Dubridge, Dr. Bacher, Dr. Lauritsen, I think President Killian, Mr. Hartley Rowe, and Mr. Harry Wynne, and Norris Bradbury. That makes how many in all? That is 11 with Bradbury. In addition to the ones for today. That is after today. I would rather doubt if it is possible for us to get prepared for redirect and I suppose some more cross-examination of Dr. Oppenheimer this week. I should think that it would not be possible to hear all these witnesses this week. We had hoped to be able to do so because we knew how much the board desired not to have to come back, nor do we ourselves wish to come back either. But I do think, as we are going, it means that there will be probably 1 day or possibly a day and a half overflow of testimony beyond what we can do in this 1 week. Yeah, so this is very interesting. This long list of people that are willing to testify on behalf of Dr. Oppenheimer, which makes sense because he is at this time, he's this leading physicist in the field of nuclear weapons and also just nuclear energy and nuclear things in general. So it makes sense that you would have all these people trying to testify on his behalf. This hearing body, this board, is not going to be accustomed to that, right? Because this is, a small regulatory agency within a small regulatory agency, you know what I mean? This is a small group of people dealing with reviewing security clearances. And so usually that's just going to involve the security clearances of run-of-the-mill individuals and employees. And it's like, oh, look, on your record you have this, so get out of here. And I haven't actually looked into this, but I imagine that most of these cases are very quick, probably just like a day at most. So this would be a very unusual case, much like high-profile cases in like the legal system will last much longer than just the case of an average person, because these are high-profile people that a lot of people know about, and there's a lot of people willing to testify on their behalf or against them, and so that just makes the situation that much more complicated. But yeah, I'll get back to it in just a second. All right. I think it is impossible to say that with any certainty at this point. Does the board have any present idea as to when it will reconvene for the sale of hearing witnesses that it wishes to call? I would expect at this point that we would proceed next week for that purpose. I don't think there will be too many witnesses. Perhaps we should proceed. Could you inform us who they are going to be? Yes, we will give you an indication. The board has not come to any final conclusion. For one thing, up until this point, I don't think that we have known all the witnesses for certain whom Dr. Oppenheimer wishes to call. I'm sure some of these the board would have called if he had not called them. I think this is the original list that I gave you a way back, Mr. Chairman. I think there may have been one or two additions since the very first. Yes. Did you mention Dr. Bush? I forgot him. I thought you did. That makes 12. He can come on 15 minutes notice, so I had him on the side. Mr. Chairman, I think this is just about it, as I gave it to you the first day. All right, can we proceed with Mr. Kennan? Mr. Marks will examine Mr. Kennan. All right. Okay, so now Kennan enters the room and takes the witness stand. And he's going to be examined by Mr. Marks, who is one of Oppenheimer's lawyers. Okay. All right. What is your full name? George Frost Kennan. Do you wish to testify under oath? You are not required to do so. I would be quite prepared to testify under oath. All the witnesses have to this point. Would you then stand, please, and raise your right hand? George Frost Kennan, do you swear that the testimony you are to give the board shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Whereupon George Frost Kennan was called as a witness, and having been first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. Will you be seated, please? It is necessary for me to point out to you the existence of the so-called perjury statutes. I shall be glad to give you an indication of the penalties if you wish. I don't think it is necessary, sir. I want to bring them to your attention. I should also like to ask that in the event, probably unlikely in this case, that it is necessary for you to disclose any restricted data in your testimony, that you advise me before such disclosure in order that we might excuse any unauthorized persons. Finally, I should like to point out to you that the proceedings and record of this board are regarded as strictly confidential between the Atomic Energy Commission and its officials participating and Dr. Oppenheimer, his representatives, and witnesses. The Commission will take no initiative in the public release of any information relating to these proceedings, and we express the hope that will be the attitude of the witness. Mr. Marks? Direct examination by Mr. Marks. Mr. Kennan, will you please identify yourself and give the board briefly your professional history? I am told that you should be addressed as Ambassador Kennan, but that does not come quite naturally to me. If I may, I would like to call you Mr. Kennan. I am now a Foreign Service Office retired. I am now a Foreign Service Office retired. That's interesting phrasing. Anyway, I grew up in Wisconsin. I had my early schooling there, went to Princeton University, and went almost immediately from Princeton University into the Foreign Service of the United States, where I served for 27 years without interruption. I retired from the Foreign Service last July and am now on a regular retired status. And what is your present position, if any? I am at present a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and in residence at the Institute, engaged in certain research and writing work, scholarly work. Will you please describe in a little more detail the highlights of your experience in the Foreign Service? I served first for a year or two in Geneva and Hamburg as a vice... I served first for a year or two in Geneva and Hamburg as a vice consul, and then was selected, this was way back in 1928, as one of the first group of men to be trained for special work in the Soviet and Russian field. We were at that time given rather a thorough course of training, usually 3 or 4 years of it. I was sent to the University of Berlin, where I spent 2 years and took the diploma of the Oriental Seminary in Berlin. And after that, I was put as a reporting officer in Berlin, first in the legation of Riga before we had any relations with the Soviet Union, and after 1933 in the Embassy of Moscow. Since that time, I have had the status in the service of a specialist on Soviet affairs. I have served on 4 different occasions in the embassy in Moscow, in various ranks, the last time as ambassador. When was that? That was in 1952. I have had other service relating to the Soviet Union, such as the so-called Russian desk in the State Department in 1937 and 1948, so I have been pretty closely in contact with Soviet problems for most of my career. What other main foreign service have you had? I've served for many years in Germany. When was that? In addition to my studies there in the earlier years, I studied during the war, or rather I served during the war, from the outbreak of war until Pearl Harbor, after I was interned for a time, so that I had nearly 3 years of wartime service in Germany, also service in Austria and Czechoslovakia and in Portugal. Prior to your retirement, what was your last position in the Department of State here? My last position was ambassador to the Soviet Union. Prior to that, I was from 1947 to 1950 director of the policy planning staff of the Department of State, and from the beginning of 1950 until the middle of that year, counselor of the Department of State. My last official position was that of counselor of the Department of State, a position that I had only for 6 months in 1950. Could you describe in just a very few sentences what your responsibilities were as head of the policy planning staff and as counselor of the State Department? The policy planning staff was established by General Marshall in the spring of 1947. I was asked to found it and to determine its composition and its procedures, and to head it initially, and did so. We were an advisory staff to the Secretary of State. We were there to advise him on questions with regard to which he might seek our advice, or on such major questions of foreign policy, and especially long-term policy, as we ourselves thought we were in an advisory. Interesting. Sometimes the phraseology in these transcripts trips me up, but let's see. I'll just read what's stated. We were there to advise him on questions with regard to which he might seek our advice, or on such major questions of foreign policy, and especially long-term policy, as we ourselves thought were in an advisory opinion to the Secretary. The staff is still in existence. Its methods of work have changed from time to time, but has remained as a permanent unit of the Department of State, and is the only body, as far as I'm aware, in the framework of the staff which has a universal competence. Its competence is not restricted to any geographic area or functional area. When you were counselor, what does the term counselor mean? Is that like assistant secretary or undersecretary? Counselor, again, is the senior advisor to the Secretary of State, who has no operational responsibility in the sense that he has no division or administrative apparatus under him. He is in purely an advisory capacity. The title has existed for many decades and is usually a man who is kept there simply on the basis of his personnel experience and, I think, personal experience and qualities, which it is felt might be useful to the Secretary, possibly to the President, as an advisor. In the hierarchy, am I right in understanding that the post of counselor is equivalent to or just under that of undersecretary? Yes, sir. It has varied. I would say it has always been between the second and the fourth place in the Department of State, depending on the Secretary of State and the counselor and the arrangements made at the moment. I should have asked you at the beginning a matter which I suppose everybody knows about, but which we ought to inquire about for the record. Are you the author, I think it is fair to say, of a rather famous article called, quote, Sources of Soviet Conduct? I am. The article was written privately for Mr. Forrestal in December 1946 and January 1947. He had asked me for a review of another paper that he had obtained from another source on this subject, and I told him I can't comment on that, but I would be glad to give you my own views, and did in this paper. Later, Mr. Armstrong, who was head of the Council on Foreign Relations and editor of the magazine Foreign Affairs, asked me if I had anything along this line that I could submit for publication, and I did on the condition that it would be published anonymously. To my horror, the article actually appeared after I had taken over the policy planning staff under General Marshall, and the authorship of it leaked, and it caused quite a sensation when it did appear. As far as I know, it did no damage. It had been duly cleared by the Department of State, so General Marshall never held it against me. I was the author of it. I don't think Mr. Robb will object to my asking you if it has not been generally regarded as a rather robust statement of the situation of the United States with respect to the peril that we faced vis-a-vis the Russians. It was an attempt to analyze the reasons for a pattern of Soviet behavior which surprised many people in this country in the months immediately following the war, and to suggest, you mean an unfriendly policy? Yes, and to suggest an approach to this problem on our part that would be hopeful and helpful. I would like to turn now to a more specific subject and ask you what you have had to do with the problem of Soviet espionage, Soviet infiltration of agents into the United States, problems of security. In the early days before our recognition of the Soviet government, when a number of us worked on the Baltic states in reading the Russian press, do you speak and read Russian? I do, sir, yes. We were rather shocked to observe the names and statements of Americans, or people who held themselves out as Americans, but who were giving statements for the press in Moscow of an extraordinary nature, and ones that indicated that their allegiance was to the Soviet Union and not to this government. Could we have the date on this, Mr. Marks? I would say roughly in the years between 1929 and 1933. At that time, we were concerned about it. I personally brought some of these names to the attention of the government back here and raised the question as to whether passports could not be denied to these people because it seemed to me evident that they had expatriated themselves in every sense of the word, subjectively. We ran up against the snarls of legislative provisions and procedural provisions of the government, and I don't believe anything was done about it at that time. After the recognition of the Soviet Union during the 30s, this continued, I must say, to be a source of concern to practically all of us, I think, who were professional officers in this field and serving in Moscow. We saw people about those intentions and activities we had great doubt. There was not much that we could do about it then from our position, except to try to see to it that those people were not used in the embassies and that they were handled with due discretion by embassy people. In other words, our concern there was primarily with the security of our own mission. I may say that I think the Moscow embassy was the first mission of our governmental service to institute proper security precautions in time of peace. We were the first people, so far as I am aware, who always had our code books accompanied day and night by an American in the room and never left them in the safes alone, and things of that sort. When did you start these security practices? From the day the mission arrived in Moscow in March 1934. We were aware of the fact you went in with the first mission. I was there prior to it. I made the physical arrangements for its arrival. I was there in the fall of 1933. We were very much aware that we could not depend on the Moscow employees, that we had to assume that all employees were sent by the Soviet police, and we could depend on no custodial employees to be secure, and we had to rely on our own sources. We brought 9 Marine sergeants with us and tried to set this thing up on our own hook as a sound show from the point of security. What experience, if any, have you had with intelligence work, using that in the somewhat broader sense than you have been speaking? What I am about to say is a matter which I think violates no classification or any document in the government, but is not one which I have ever spoke about publicly, and I say it only for the information of the board. I was during the war for a year and a half in Lisbon in the capacity of counselor of the legation, and there, by arrangement with people in Washington, a special function as the coordinator of American intelligence activities in Portugal. Those activities, as you will recall, were very important during the war. The various American intelligence services had a very difficult time coordinating their activities with one another and with the British, and it fell to me in a personal and quiet way to try to straighten out all those tangles, and to see that our agencies acted in accord with one another, and particularly in accord with what our allies were doing. The dangers of confusion were really very great and could play into German hands very easily. Were you also mindful in those experiences of the earlier insights and perceptions that you had with the nature of and difficulty of relations with Soviet Russia? I felt that the earlier experience with Soviet problems, and especially the security problems concerned with work in the Soviet Union, stood me in very good stead in Portugal. Russian espionage then was not our problem. It was Germans we were facing during the war. But it was, I believe, partly because of the experience I had with Soviet matters that I was selected to do this job of wartime coordination. In what connections have you known Dr. Oppenheimer? I first met Dr. Oppenheimer, so far as I can recall, when I was Deputy of Foreign Affairs, that is equivalent to Deputy Commandant for Foreign Affairs at the National War College here in Washington in 1946. Dr. Oppenheimer lectured there. I was in charge of political instruction generally. I heard the lecture and was very much impressed by the eminence, clarity, and precision and scrupulousness of thought by which it was characterized. I then took over this responsibility as head of the policy planning staff in the Department of State, and in the ensuing years until the summer of 1950, when I left the Department of State, I met Dr. Oppenheimer on numbers of occasions in the course of my work. Those occasions were practically all ones, or almost all ones, in which we had to work on the formulation of foreign policy in fields that required the collaboration of other departments of government, and notably the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense. The main fields with which I was concerned were those of the international control of atomic energy and the straightening out of our relations with our own allies, particularly the British and the Canadians, in matters affecting our ability to obtain raw materials for the conduct of our atomic energy program here. In attempting to meet the problems of foreign policy that arose out of those questions, we found it necessary to sit down together with representatives of the Defense Department and the Atomic Energy Commission, and to work as a group in determining our governmental positions. In the course of those consultations, I sat several times, at least, in rooms here in government offices with Dr. Oppenheimer and participated in consultations in which he also participated. Some of those meetings I chaired. I remember at least one which he chaired. It depended on where we met. Were these matters on which you sat of importance? How would you describe them? I would describe them as matters of the greatest delicacy and of, I think, quite vital importance to the conduct of our entire atomic energy program in this country. They were all matters which were given the highest possible security classification at the time, and I do not recall that we ever had any leaks about them. They were conducted in complete secrecy. Were these matters in which issues arose involving actual or potential conflicts between positions and alternatives that our government was considering, and those that you would have expected or knew that the Russians were taking? Only with respect to the international control of atomic energy was that true. I must say the bitterest problems after the time that I came in, the ones that preoccupied me most, were ones involving our effort to straighten our relations with our own allies and to place them on a satisfactory basis. In connection with the latter type of problems, were the positions that you were working towards positions that you expected or knew to be uncongenial to the Russians or hostile to the Russians? The very reason we worked so hard on these matters and took them so seriously, when you say these matters, the questions with relation to our allies at that time, the very reason we worked so hard on them and took them so seriously was that we were aware that if the questions involved were not solved in some satisfactory manner, the only people who could gain by that would be the leaders of the Soviet Union. They would have derived the greatest possible satisfaction and profit to their own foreign political purposes had these negotiations not been successful, and had real differences and ugly differences been permitted to develop between ourselves and the British and the Canadians. I think the reasons for that are obvious. The supplies of raw material which we required were ones to which we had access only by virtue of agreements which also involved the British, and we could have gotten into very, very embarrassing and difficult positions. So this is interesting. This guy is like a, ambassador, like international relations guy, and it's really interesting to hear his perspective and his experience with Russia, the Soviet Union, because during this time, let me check. So it's right. This hearing is happening in 1954, and so that is right just about a year after the death of Joseph Stalin. But up until that point, since 1923, I think it was Stalin. Yeah, since 1922 to 1952, Stalin was in office. So that's 30 years. So all this time, all of Kennan's work here was under the Stalin regime in Russia, and that was a particularly brutal regime, very, very totalitarian, before the sort of liberalizing of certain laws that would come in the following decades. But yeah, so it's just very interesting to hear, it's like basically everything in the Soviet Union that the Americans are dealing with. It's just assumed that everyone is a security threat, and that's probably a fair assumption to make at this point. And yeah, so just some interesting stuff and just some context on the timeline there. But anyway, continuing. These problems that you're talking about then concerned the raw materials, or at least in part concerned the raw materials problem. That is correct. Raw materials for atomic energy. That is correct, they did. A collaboration was required between the two governments, and at the time that I came into these matters in 1947, it seemed evident to me that that collaboration was very seriously threatened by the way that events had developed to date. And it was time that both our government and the British government gave them the most serious thought. We did. I think it fair to say that we were successful in tiding these relationships over a very crucial and difficult period, primarily the period of the years of 1948 and 1949. And yeah, at this point, the world, like during this period right after World War II, it was broadly considered that the world had three superpowers, being America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. By the 50s, people had sort of recognized that Britain had lost a lot of its power, military, economically. It had also, started to lose a bunch of its colonies. So, Britain greatly declined in power, and it became just the US versus Russia. But at this point, British scientific prowess and strength was very important to the Manhattan Project and later developments in nuclear energy. You are confident that the Russians would have profited greatly if the result had been opposite. Yes, I can assure you that the source of my own alarm and concern about these matters was the conviction that if we failed to solve the problems involved, the Russians would be the gainers. Did Dr. Oppenheimer have a role of any importance in these deliberations that you have described? He was one of a number of officials, people in our governmental establishment, who were concerned with these matters. I say in our governmental establishment. I do not recall exactly what his position was at the time, but he was in councils of the government about such matters, sat in on a number of these discussions, at least 2 or 3 that I recall specifically, I think. That is on raw materials. On raw materials. It is my recollection, and a very vivid recollection, that his participation was extremely helpful to us, so much so that I'm not sure really whether we would have been able to do what we did at all without his help. I would like to remind you, Mr. Kennan, that I think during the period of years that you are referring to Dr. Oppenheimer was for the most of the time chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. Yes. As a result of your experience with Dr. Oppenheimer in the cases that you have reference to, what convictions, if any, did you form about him? I formed the conviction that he was an immensely useful person in the councils of our government, and I felt a great sense of gratitude that we had his help. I am able to say that in the course of all these contacts and deliberations within the government, I never observed anything in his conduct or his words that could possibly, it seemed to me, have indicated that he was animated by any other motives than a devotion to the interests of this country. There we go. Did you ever observe anything that would possibly have suggested to you that he was taking positions that the Russians would have liked? No, I cannot say that I did in any way. After all, the whole purpose of these exercises was to do things which were in the interest of this country, not in the interests of the Soviet Union, at least not in the interests of the Soviet Union as their leaders saw it at that time. Anyone who collaborated sincerely and enthusiastically in the attempt to reach our objectives, which Dr. Oppenheimer did, obviously was not serving the Soviet purposes in any way. Have you said that he contributed significantly to the results? Yes, I have, sir. Mr. Kennan, is there any possibility in your mind that he was dissembling? There is in my mind no possibility that Dr. Oppenheimer was dissembling. How do you know that? How can anybody know that? I realize that is not an assertion that one could make with confidence about everyone. If I make it with regard to Dr. Oppenheimer, it's because I feel and believe that after years of seeing him in various ways, not only there in government, but later as an associate and a neighbor and a friend at Princeton, I know his intellectual makeup and something of his personal makeup, and I consider it really out of the question that any man could have participated as he did in these discussions, could have bared his thoughts to us after time, in the way that he did, could have thought those thoughts, so to speak, in our presence, and have been at the same time dissembling. I realize that is still not wholly the answer. The reason I feel it is out of the question that could have happened is that I believed him to have an intellect of such a nature that it would be impossible for him to speak dishonestly about any subject to which he had given his deliberate and careful and professional attention. That is the view I hold of him. I have the greatest respect for Dr. Oppenheimer's mind. I think it's one of the great minds of this generation of Americans. A mind like that is not without its implications. Without its what? Implications for a man's general personality. I think it would be actually the one thing probably in life that Dr. Oppenheimer could never do. That is, to speak dishonestly about a subject which had really engaged the responsible attention of his intellect. My whole impression of him is that he is a man who, when he turns his mind to something in an orderly and responsible way, examines it with the most extraordinary scrupulousness and fastidiousness of intellectual process. I must say that I cannot conceive that in those deliberations in government he could have been speaking disingenuously to us about these matters. I would suppose that you might just as well have asked Leonardo da Vinci to distort an anatomical drawing as that you should ask Robert Oppenheimer to speak responsibly to the sort of questions we were talking about and speak dishonestly. Mr. Kennan, in saying what you have just said, are you saying it with an awareness of the background that Dr. Oppenheimer has, the general nature of which is reflected in the letter which General Nichols addressed to him, which is the genesis of these proceedings and his response? I am, sir. How do you reconcile these two things? I do not think that they are necessarily inconsistent one with the other. People advance in life for one thing. I saw Dr. Oppenheimer at a phase of his life in which most of these matters in General Nichols' letter did not apply. It seems to me also that I was concerned or associated with him in the examination of problems which both he and I had accepted as problems of governmental responsibility before us, and I do not suppose that was the case with all the things that were mentioned in General Nichols' letter about his early views about politics and his early activities and his early associations. I also think it quite possible for a person to be himself profoundly honest and yet have associations and friends who may be misguided and misled, and for whom either at the time or in retrospect he may feel intensely sorry and concerned. I think most of us have had the experience of having known people at one time in our lives of whom we felt that way. I think one might interpret this correspondence that I have referred to as going even further than that. I won't go into what has been testified here or a characterization of that which has been said in this room, but in the correspondence itself, an incident is referred to. I assume you have read the correspondence. I have in a cursory way as a newspaper reader reads it in the newspapers. An incident is referred to in 1943, in which it is said that an approach to Dr. Oppenheimer was made under circumstances suggesting that the approach was somehow connected with a possible effort by the Russians to secure information or to secure information in their behalf, and that for some months thereafter he failed to report this incident. What effect does that failure on his part, which he freely admits was wrong, have on your present thinking about him? Mr. Marks, I have testified about him here as I have known him. I can well understand that at earlier periods in his life, conflicts of conscience might have arisen, as I think they could with any sensitive person, between his feelings and his friends, perhaps his pity for them and his governmental duties. On the other hand, I would also be inclined to bear in mind the fact that in 1943, the Soviet Union was hardly regarded by our top people in our government as an enemy, that great masses of American materials were going to be prepared for shipment to the Soviet Union, many of them, I assume, involving the transmission of official secrets. I could imagine that the implications of this may not at that time have appeared to be so sinister as they do today in retrospect, and I could also imagine if, after all, the information was not given in this particular instance, the man in question might have felt that no damage had been done to the governmental interest, and that the question of the men who had initiated such a request might be better perhaps left to their own conscience and to the process of maturity in their own development. I don't know. I can imagine those things. For that reason, I would hesitate to make definitive judgments on the basis simply of what I read in the letter of indictment. Would it change your opinion if I were to suggest to you that when Dr. Oppenheimer did report this incident to security officers on his own initiative, as it turned out, he didn't tell them everything. He didn't tell them everything about it. He still withheld the name of the friend and told them a story that was not the whole truth. Mr. Marks, I do not think that would alter anything on the statement that I just made prior to your question. I might only add to it that I could well conceive that Dr. Oppenheimer might have done things which he would think in retrospect were mistakes, or which others would conclude in retrospect were mistakes, but that would not preclude in his own instance any more than it would in the case of any of the others the process of growth and the ability to recognize mistakes and to learn from them and to make fewer in the future. What I have said about his activities, his personality, the cast of his mind during the years when I knew him, would, I think, not be affected. These convictions that you have expressed about him, the confidence that you have expressed in him, what part is played in that judgment by the experience that you had as a Soviet expert? I think a considerable part. One of the convictions that I have carried away from such experience as I have had with these matters in the field of Soviet work concerning the Soviet Union is that these things cannot really be judged in a fully adequate way without looking at the man as an entirety. That is, I am skeptical about any security processes that attempt to sample different portions of a man's nature separate from his whole being. I must say, as one who has seen Robert Oppenheimer now over the course of several years and more latterly outside of government, that I have these feelings and entertain them on the basis of my estimate of his personality and his character as a whole. Are they feelings or are they convictions? They are on my part convictions, sir. Mr. Kennan, let me turn now to quite a different subject. In your capacity as head of the policy planning staff in the State Department, were you ever consulted about the problem of the hydrogen bomb which came up, to refresh your recollection of the date, towards the end of 1949? Yes, I was consulted by the Secretary of State in that connection. although I was not asked and could not really properly have been asked to give an opinion to him officially as to whether we should or should not proceed to the development of this weapon. My recollection is that... Would you wait just a minute? I need to ask Mr. Garrison a question. May I have a 30-second interval here? I need to ask Mr. Garrison about a matter. Yes. Thank you very much. Then 30 seconds of chit-chat, and then back to the examination. I was about to ask you, what were the circumstances under which you were consulted? I can only give my recollection here, and I must say my recollection of all these official matters at that time are somewhat telescoped and entirely capable of being in error with regard to the details. But the recollection is simply this. When it was first made known to the Secretary of State there was a technical possibility of going ahead with the development of this weapon, at least to the extent the government now had before it a decision as to whether to develop the weapon or not. The question of making it. The question of making a decision as to whether to attempt to develop the weapon or not. When that state of affairs was first brought to the attention of the Secretary of State, he, at a very early stage there, asked me into his office. My recollection is that Dr. Oppenheimer was there, and there may possibly have been one or two other people, but I do not remember who they were. We spoke about this, and the only thing I can remember, I think, of that conversation is that we were all agreed that regardless of how the decision might fall, it was important that this government should re-examine its position with respect to the international control of atomic energy to make sure that nothing had been left undone from our side to get international agreement about these weapons before we proceeded with this program of the hydrogen bomb. In other words, we wanted to make absolutely certain that before launching on this new phase of the atomic weapons race, our position in the United Nations on the International Court of Atomic Energy was the best position that we could devise, and most hopeful one. The Secretary of State asked me to re-examine this question, to have another look at our international negotiation position as we had exposed it in the United Nations bodies with regard to the international control of atomic energy, and to see whether... One moment. Okay. The Secretary of State asked me to re-examine this question, to have another look at our international negotiation position as we had exposed it in the United Nations bodies with regard to the international control of atomic energy, and to see whether that was still sound, whether anything had happened in the circumstances of the preceding 2 or 3 years since we had advanced it to change the assumptions on which it rested, whether there was anything more that we could now propose which might have a chance of putting an end to the atomic weapons race instead of facing us with the necessity of going ahead with it. I did look at this problem in the course of the ensuing weeks, and my recollection is that I gave my opinion to the Secretary of State in January 1950 on that subject. I take it that on at least one or perhaps more occasions in the course of carrying out this assignment, or at least the initiation of it, you heard Dr. Oppenheimer express his views. I recall going to Princeton in the fall of 1949 on one occasion. I had several things to do there. I called on Dr. Oppenheimer at the Institute, if my memory is correct, and we discussed it then. I was also once at some time in that period, I don't know exactly when, asked to appear before the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, simply as a consultant. They wanted to hear my views. They asked me questions. The questions related primarily to the present state of our relations with the Soviet Union, the state of what we called the Cold War. I replied as frankly as I could to them. What impression did you get, if you remember it, of Dr. Oppenheimer's views? I would not be able to quote his views in memory, or in any detail, or in any great accuracy. I can only say that the general impression I carried with me was the impression of a man who was greatly troubled by what he felt to be the extremely solemn implications of this decision. That is the pending decision. The pending decision. Who realized that it was one the implications of which might carry very far. That it was almost impossible to predict where we might end up if this sort of a race with weapons of mass destruction were to go on indefinitely, and there was greatly troubled and concerned, and therefore was greatly troubled and concerned to arrive at the most enlightened and sound decision that could be made. Did he try to sell you on any view? It's not my recollection that he did. I fear that I talked more about my own views here than he did about his... I fear that I talked more about my own views here than he did about his with regard to this subject, but I do not have the recollection that he endeavored to persuade me that any answer to this problem was the right one or the wrong one. To me, then, we were still at a preliminary stage in it. The entire effort, really on the part of both of us then, was to try to identify the considerations that were relevant to the problem, to see what we had that we could really hang on to in approaching the decision. When it came time for you to give the Secretary of State your views or your analysis of the problem, what did you report to him, and when was it approximately? I reported to him approximately in the month of January. I would think around the middle of the month or shortly after. 1950? 1950, yes. The gist of my own views was simply this. I felt that this government was in no way in good position to make any great decisions with regard to either the international control of atomic energy or actually with regard to its own weapons program before it gained greater clarity in its own mind as to the purposes for which it was holding what were sometimes called the ABC weapons in general. By that, I'm thinking of the weapons of mass destruction, the atomic, chemical, and so forth. It seemed to me that there was unclarity in the councils of our government as to the reasons why we were cultivating and holding these weapons. The unclarity revolved around this question. We were holding them only as a means of deterring other people from using them against us and retaliating against any such use of these weapons against us, or were building them into our military establishment in such a way that would indicate that we were going to be dependent upon them in any future war, and would have to use them, regardless of whether they were used against us first. Have we not taken the position that we would only use them for purposes of retaliation? It is not my impression that we have, and it was not my impression at that time that there was any such determination in the councils of the U.S. government. On the other hand, if I remember correctly, I was able to cite statements that had been made by some of our high military leaders, I think both in the councils of this government and in the NATO councils of Europe, which indicated very strongly that we were getting ourselves into a position where we would have to use these weapons as forward military weapons, regardless of whether they were used against us. The point that I tried to emphasize to the Secretary of State related, of course, directly to the question of international control about which I had been asked. I told him that I thought we ought first to face this problem. It was my belief that we should hold these weapons only for purposes of retaliation, and as a deterrent to their use against us. That anything else would get us into a race with these mass destruction weapons to which I could see no end, which I was afraid would distort the thinking of the public mind about these problems, which I was afraid would distort the thinking of the public mind about problems of foreign policy and military policy in this country if it were permitted to proceed. So, as I say, I favored the holding of these weapons only for purposes of retaliation and as a deterrent. Whether that came out clearly in my report to the Secretary of State, I don't know, because that was not actually the question that was asked me. But I'm sure it was implicit in what I said to the Secretary, and by the same token, I think it was implicit that we ought really to make this other decision before we made decisions about the hydrogen bomb. So that's an interesting concern there, which ultimately history has played out differently. But, he's concerned that, look, if we keep spending all our military budget on atomic bombs that we can't actually use, then we're not going to be spending enough on weapons that we can actually use. And so then we're going to be forced to use the atomic bomb because that's just the only thing we're going to have. And that would obviously lead to mutually assured destruction. But it is interesting because this is such an early stage in the development of nuclear weapons that you had very wild seeming proposals floating around that today would just sound crazy. Like during the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur proposed using 50 atomic bombs to shut down the border between North Korea and China because the Chinese government was using that border to send Chinese reinforcements into North Korea to assist in the invasion of South Korea. And so, using 50 atomic bombs along the border of North Korea would be a pretty effective way to stop reinforcements from coming through. But that would be a ridiculous precedent to set, that you can use these weapons tactically in warfare, especially since hydrogen bombs are just of another scale as atomic bombs. The question would be, would the use of atomic bombs allow the use of hydrogen bombs? And that would be a very, frightening reality. So it is a pretty fair concern to say, let's put more of our resources into other areas that will actually be more useful for the interests of the United States. But yeah, that is just a very interesting thought. Because obviously history has gone in a very different direction than that, in that, nuclear weapons have not been used since the end of World War II. So, so we have put stock into other kinds of weaponry. But anyway. Mr. Kennan, you will have to explain a little more to me, at least what you have conceived to be the relevance of clarification of this question to the question of whether or not we ought to proceed with making hydrogen bombs. Yes. As I saw it, the relevance was this. If you were asked, should we or should we not proceed to the development of a whole new range of more powerful atomic weapons, which was involved in the hydrogen bomb decision, you had to ask yourself, how much do we need the weapons of mass destruction in general? That is the first question that had to be faced, because if you already had enough, perhaps you didn't need the hydrogen bomb at all. I could not see how you could answer the question of how much do we need until you had answered the question of why are we holding these weapons anyway, and what do we expect to accomplish with them. If you were holding them as deterrents and for purposes of retaliation, really for purposes in order that they might not be used against you, then what you needed was merely enough to make it an unprofitable and unpromising undertaking on the part of anyone else, the Russians in particular, to use these weapons against us. If, on the other hand, you were going to regard them as an integral part of forward American military planning, and something on which we would be dependent in a future war, regardless of the circumstances of the origin of that war, then you came up with a different answer, or you might come up with a different one, in regard to the hydrogen bomb. So the point you are making is not that you were opposed to the hydrogen bomb necessarily, but only it seemed to you that it was essential first that this other subsidiary question should be clarified. That's correct. I must say that personally, while I was not competent to form a finished opinion on this and was never called upon to do so, I had not at that time seen the evidence that what we already held in the old and regular atomic bomb, if I may speak of it that way, was not enough to make it a fruitless undertaking from the standpoint of Soviet policy to launch a war on us with these weapons. In other words, I considered the burden of proof to rest on that point. It seemed to me you would have to prove that we could not do the job with the weapons we already had, and to my knowledge that was never demonstrated to me at the time. Perhaps the answer might have been one thing or the other, but I had never seen the proof. I think that is all. Mr. Robb? All right, now we have cross-examination by Mr. Robb. Mr. Kennan, that was a most interesting discussion. I certainly have enjoyed it. Thank you, sir. Mr. Kennan, I was interested in your description of your security precautions which you took over in Russia. I believe you said you brought in 6 Marine sergeants to assist? That is correct, sir. How did you happen to turn to the Marines rather than the State Department? The person who deserves the credit for that was Ambassador Bullitt, our first ambassador to the Soviet Union. Mr. Bullitt had very strong feelings about security, and had, I believe, had something to do with the Navy. I asked to be excused here. At one time or another, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, or in any case, he knew people in the naval establishment, and he asked President Roosevelt to arrange it and get Marine sergeants. He was something of an expert on Russian espionage, wasn't he? At least he was very security conscious by that time, and was helpful, I must say, in that way. Did you give these Marines a pretty thorough checking over before you brought them into the embassy? I don't believe so. These things were rather primitive compared to our present standard today. We left that to the command staff of the Marine Corps. I must say, though, I think they were very hardy and loyal Americans, the fellows we got. Our difficulties with them were not ones of security. They were other kinds. I can imagine that. Supposing you had learned that one of these Marines, or anybody else who had to deal with your security matters, said that he had recently been a member of the Communist Party, but had left the party just before coming to your embassy, would you have had him around? I think our tendency would certainly have been to urge that he not be in the Moscow embassy at that time. He would presumably have had still some contacts with people in Moscow, which would have been undesirable. Or if he had any close connections with the Communist Party, I assume you would not have been very enthusiastic about having him around then, would you? That is correct, for our purposes there in the embassy. Have you had much experience, Mr. Kennan, with communists? I just don't know how to express it. Are you familiar with communist dogma or technique? I think I am, sir. I have had about 20 years of reading the Soviet press and sometimes other press organs with the view to determining whether they reflected that type of dogma or not. I feel I have a certain familiarity with it. Would you place much weight in a statement of a communist that he just left the party or had disassociated himself with it before coming on some secret work for the government? I would certainly regard it as a factor very seriously relevant to fitness for office, but one to be examined individually. You asked a moment ago about the case of our embassy out there. Mr. Bullitt, for whom I had the greatest respect, and about whose security I never had the faintest doubt, had been married to the widow of John Reed, who was the first prominent American communist, I suppose, in this country. We didn't find that a source of worry with regard to Mr. Bullitt. No, I'm talking rather than matrimonial association, more active association with the Communist Party. Would you tend to view the considerable skepticism would you tend to view with considerable skepticism a statement of a man who admitted that he had been an active member of the Communist Party or had been active in communist affairs, a statement of such a man that he had just left the Communist Party or left communist affairs on the eve of coming to work in the embassy? Wouldn't you view that statement with some skepticism? I think we would have regarded it as a factor which meant that there was a certain burden of proof to demonstrate that the man's value to us was very great, and that this could be satisfactorily explained away, and we had something that we could depend on in judging that he was now a person whose loyalty we didn't need to worry about. Just for the record, Mr. Kennan, I think it is plain, but was it 1946 that you had these discussions with Dr. Oppenheimer down at the War College? I don't recall discussions down there except possibly after his lecture, but it was in 1946 to my recollection that he lectured there, and that I first met him. Was that the year when you were taking various positions which Mr. Marx said would not be accepted by the Russians with much favor? Was that the year 1946? No, it was the following year. 1947? 1947. Mr. Kennan, of course you don't know anything about what Dr. Oppenheimer testified before this board, do you, sir? I know nothing whatsoever about it, sir. I have not discussed it with anyone. Coming to your discussion of the problem which confronted you gentlemen when you were deciding whether or not to go ahead with the hydrogen bomb, I do understand, Mr. Kennan, that your thought is that whether we wanted the hydrogen bomb merely for retaliation or whether we wanted it for affirmative action, if I may put it that way, in either event we wanted the bomb. No, my feeling is that until you decided that first question, you didn't know whether you wanted the bomb or not. I see. Because if what you had in mind was retaliation, there is a possibility that what we already had would have been enough. I disagreed on numbers of occasions with lots of the other analysts in this government as to the number of the old bombs that would have to be used against the Soviet Union to produce very serious disruption of its life. We have disagreed about the feelings of the Soviet leaders with regard to this. I don't think personally that any war in which as many as 10 of these bombs were dropped with a reasonable degree of accuracy on Soviet cities and installations would be regarded by the Kremlin leaders as worth a candle. Which bombs are you talking about? Even the old-fashioned kind. You must remember that these men, since the revolution in these 38 years, have transpired since the revolution, have with great trouble and pain succeeded in building up a certain amount or a considerable amount of industry in Russia. That is their pride and joy politically. That is the thing that they claim they were going to do, to industrialize this country. Their aim has been to catch up with and overtake America, and their great boast is that in a primitive and partially underdeveloped country, they have succeeded pretty much with their own resources in producing now major industry. What I would like to emphasize is that these plants, these industrial communities they have built, those are the apples of their eye. They do value them immensely high. It would be for them, according to their lights, a heartbreaking thing to have any of these places destroyed again. As I say, I have often not agreed with other government experts about this. I felt that the Soviet Union was fairly vulnerable to this type of bombing due to the high degree of concentration of its industrial strength in the individual plants. I have often pointed out, if you take the top 3 steel plants in the Soviet Union, you get something like 40 or 50% of the Soviet steel production. If you take the top 3 steel plants in the United States, you get something like 18% of ours. Therefore, they are vulnerable in certain ways that we are not. For that reason, I was never satisfied that it was possible to say that we did not have enough in the way of retaliatory capacity even before we proceeded to the hydrogen bomb. I always wanted to see that clarified. Yeah, that is a very interesting point, is that the more concentrated your industry is, the more effective nuclear weapons are against you. That's part of why the U.S. highway system was built, so that you could, spread things out a bit more and more effectively distance people from city centers that would potentially be the centers of attack in a nuclear war. Mr. Kennan, did you have any view in 1950 as to whether or not the Russians would attempt to develop the hydrogen bomb, whether we did or not? I do not recall specifically. I think I may have doubted that they would proceed to the development of it, and I think I may have been in error on that point, as I look at it today. Do you have any doubt now that they would have, whether we did or not? I'm still not sure that they would have, because I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the scientific and the economic aspects of this problem to know how worthwhile they would have regarded it. It may perfectly well be that they would have said the hydrogen bomb will call for this and this amount of investment in scientific personnel and materials, and perhaps we would be better off to put that investment into the older type of atomic weapons. That was more of a scientific question that you were not qualified to deal with. I was not qualified to deal with it. I would like to ask you a question as an expert on diplomacy, Mr. Kennan. Supposing the Russians had developed the hydrogen bomb and had got it and we didn't have it, what would then be our position vis-a-vis the Russians in any negotiations? That, of course, is a key question and a very penetrating one. It is one which I have had no occasion to argue, it is one I have had occasion to argue many times with my friends here in Washington. I do not think that the position would have been so much different from what it is today. The Russians have, for reasons which I don't think include any altruism or anything like that, or idealism, but they have been very, very careful not to use the weapons of mass destruction as a threat to other people. I don't recall any time that the Russians have ever threatened as a means of political pressure to use these weapons against anybody else. On the contrary, their position has been consistently all along that they were holding them. Whether this is true or not, it has been their public position that they were holding them for purposes only of retaliation and deterrence, and would not use them unless they were used against them. It would be a change of Soviet policy if they were to attempt to use any of these weapons as a means of pressure. I have also always had doubts, I realize this is a very difficult thing to express, as to whether the fact that perhaps one party had weapons of this sort, a little more destructive or greatly more destructive than the other, would nevertheless change this situation so vitally. We did, after all, have the old type of bomb. We had some means of delivery. I think the world would have gone along pretty much the same. I have in mind, in making that judgment, the fact that atomic weapons are not the only weapons of mass destruction that exist. There are also extremely ugly and terrible biological and chemical weapons, at least we have been allowed to think there are, and if the Russians want to create destruction in this country solely for the sake of destruction, I think there are other means by which they can do it than the hydrogen bomb. You don't feel, then, that we would have been at any disadvantage as against the Russians if they had the hydrogen bomb and we had not? I'm not absolutely certain. I cannot give you a flat negative answer to that. Perhaps we would have been. Perhaps I have been wrong about this, but I think that our position with regard to them has depended much less on the mathematical equation of who has this and who has that in the way of weapons of mass destruction than we think it has. After all, our problems with them, as I have seen them on the political side, were very much the same in the days when we had the monopoly of the atomic weapon as they are today, my way of thinking. They are pretty much the same old problems. I really do not suspect these people, Mr. Robb, of a desire to drop this thing on us just out of some native contrariness, or desire to wreak destruction for destruction's sake in this country. I think they are people who fight wars for very specific political purposes, and usually to get control over some area or territory contiguous to what they already have. I have often had occasion to say that there is only one real question that interests these people, I mean the Soviet leaders, and that is the question of who has the ability to haul people out of bed at 3 in the morning and cause them to disappear without giving any accounting for them and where. In other words, who can exercise totalitarian police power over a given territory, and where can you do it? That is what they are interested in knowing. They think that everybody else rules the way they rule. They are always interested in the territorial problem. For that reason, I don't think that these weapons play such a part in their thinking as they play in ours. They want to know not only how to destroy territory, but how to get control of it, and dominate it, and run people. Of course, you will agree that if you were mistaken in that evaluation, it would be a very serious mistake. I agree, and for that reason I have, I believe, always had a certain caution with regard to my own views. Yes, sir. Mr. Kennan, you spoke of the Russian policy as manifested to you. Do you believe the Russians were sincere in their manifestations to you of their policy? No. We have never drawn our judgments of their policy from a literal interpretation of their words. There is no reason why these people should ever have been sincere in anything that they said to a capitalist government. They may have been on occasions, but there is no real reason for it. Yeah, so a few interesting things from what we've just read here is, I think this was a quote used in the Oppenheimer movie, was like, if you drown in 10 feet of water or 10,000 feet of water, you've still drowned, which is kind of the point that Kennan's making here, which is that, does it really matter if you have the hydrogen bomb? Because, the cost of getting into a nuclear war is so high, even with just atomic bombs, that it's kind of overkill. And if the purpose of these weapons is just for retaliation and not for, preemptive use, as a forward military action, then there's really no point in having many more of them than 10, because it's costly enough to your enemy to, have 10 nuclear weapons as it is to have, hundreds of hydrogen bombs. But anyway. Putting it in the language of the ordinary man, you just can't trust them, isn't that right? That is correct. They do not really expect to be trusted. That's pretty funny, too. That the Soviets are like, look, we know that you don't trust us. We're saying this anyway. But, it makes sense, because after years and years of, a government policy of lying, it's pretty hard to curry any, respectability from your negotiators. So that's funny. Thank you very much. May I ask you some questions, Mr. Kennan? First of all, may I assume that you are familiar in general terms with the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and therefore some of the framework within which this board is operating? I would be glad to go into it if you wish. Against that background, and with all the facts which are coming before us in these proceedings, you are aware, of course, that this board faces very difficult decisions. I don't want to make statements for you, but would you think that we face very difficult decisions in this proceeding? I do, there is no doubt about it. I'm sure you are here to be helpful in this inquiry. I trust, therefore, that you will not misapprehend any questions I ask, which are quite serious and relate to some of the deeper issues involved. You have testified, I think, without reservation, as to your judgment of Dr. Oppenheimer's character and loyalty, as you have known him and on the basis of your knowledge. That's right, sir. In your experience in government, have you ever known well any persons whose loyalty and character you respected and admired, about whom it developed that you perhaps were later mistaken on account of issues we are talking about in this inquiry? I'm racking my memory here. I can recall people I have respected and admired who later turned out to be, even in my own opinion, unfit for government service by virtue of personal weakness. I do not recall anyone who was ever a friend of mine and with whom I had any degree of association in the discussion of political matters relating to the Soviet Union, who later turned out to be a person unfit for government service by virtue of any disloyalty or of any ideological weakness. I cannot recall any such person. There have been one or two times, Mr. Chairman, when I have been obliged to draw to the attention of the government circumstances with regard to government employees, which seemed to me to point to a likelihood that they were not loyal American citizens. I have done that on occasions. I was not competent to make a final decision as to whether they were or were not, but I have had to report circumstances which looked to me to be suspicious and I believed were. But those were people with whom I was not closely associated. They were minor employees. What I happened to know about them were things I was able to observe in the course of official work. If you were today director of the policy planning staff, and there came to you from a staff member or from some other source, perhaps even the Secretary of State, that a certain individual had been made a member of the policy planning staff who had had close communist associations as late as the late 30s or perhaps early 40s, would you seriously consider adding such a person to your staff today? It would depend, Mr. Chairman, on what I would think were his possibilities for contribution to the staff and to what extent the negative points on his record had been balanced out by a record of constructive achievement and loyalty. I might say, by way of example, that when I first set up the staff, I rejected one man who had been recommended to me actually by higher authority in the government because he had appeared as a character witness for a man who was convicted as being a communist, and I thought at best his judgment was bad. But I rejected in that instance this man who had no previous record of experience in the government. I was not under the impression that his contribution would be a major one, or that it would be worthwhile doing it in that case. I must say, if it were a person of outstanding capabilities, and especially a person who had, in addition to the negative factors, rendered distinguished service to the government, then I would want to look at it very hard. I assume that if it were a secretary, for example, or clerical assistant, that it would be easier for you to decide that the person should not be employed. I think that would be correct. So I gather that you feel that perhaps the application of individual judgment increases with the statute and importance of the individual concerned. That is perhaps not a clear question. I do feel this, that the really gifted and able people in government are perhaps less apt than the others to have had a fully conventional life, and a fully conventional entry, let us say, into their government responsibilities. For that reason, I think that while their cases have to be examined with particular care, obviously for the reasons of the great responsibilities they bear and the capabilities for damage in case one makes a mistake, nevertheless, it is necessary to bear in mind in many cases, especially people who have great intellectual attainments, because those attainments often, it seems to me, do not always come by the most regular sort of experience in life. They are often the result of a certain amount of buffeting, and a certain amount of trial and error, and a certain amount of painful experience. I think that has to be borne in mind when one uses people of that sort. I agree it presents a special problem, not an easy one for the government. I have the greatest sympathy for the people who have to face it. You in your testimony referred to the possible conflicts of conscience a man might have, and you used the expression, I think, pity for friends who perhaps have been misguided. I'm not sure those were the words, but the general import. You perhaps are aware that under the Act, one of the criteria imposed by the language of the Act seems to be the associations of an individual. I know you feel that past associations must be weighed in the light of more recent conduct and other factors you have stated. Would you feel continued association with individuals falling in this category for whom one would have pity and with respect to whom one might have had conflicts of conscience was important at all in the situation? I would think, Mr. Chairman, that it is a thing which would have to be explained, but I find great difficulty in accepting the belief that a man must rule out all those associations, whether or not they engage in any way his official responsibilities. I think there are certainly times when they are to be avoided. I suppose most of us have had friends or associates whom we have come to regard as misguided with the course of time. And I don't like to think that people in senior capacity in government should not be permitted or conceded maturity of judgment to know when they can see such a person or when they can't. If they come to you sometimes, I think it is impossible for you to turn them away abruptly or in a cruel way, simply because you are afraid of association with them, so long as what they are asking of you is nothing that affects your governmental work. I myself say it is a personal view on the part of Christian charity to try to be at least as decent as you can to them. I realize that it is not advisable for a man in a position of high security to be seen steadily with people about whose loyalty there is a great doubt, unless they happen to be intimates in his family or something like that. Okay, so I see a comment from CDP says, "My respect, brother." Thank you, CDP. Yeah, anyway, I will continue. But when you say intimates of his family, you mean blood relationships. Something of that sort. Or marital relationships and things of that sort. Yes. You said an individual should not decline to see such a person if the approach were made by such other person. Would you think it would be questionable if a person in a high position took the initiative himself in seeing one of his former associates about whom there might be some question? It's difficult for me to judge in the absence of the knowledge of the circumstances. I understand. I'm aware of this as a very difficult problem of professional ethics. It seems to me once or twice I have had conflicts of this sort myself, but I know that in these cases I would always like to have felt that my superiors in government had enough confidence in me to let me handle that problem according to my own best conscience. I do worry about the sort of schoolboy relationship to one's friends and acquaintances which gets involved if you apply too rigid standards of security in that respect. But you would always feel that in any conflict between loyalty to a friend and obligation to government, it would not be a conflict difficult to resolve. No, sir, it would not. There is only one way in which it can be resolved, and that is in favor of the government. If that is impossible, then I would say a man should resign. He should not permit himself to remain in the government with any conflict of loyalties of that sort. One of the hard facts of our times, of course, is the inevitable conflict of the requirements of what we generally refer to as security and what we like to think of unlimited freedoms of man's mind and conscience. This may be a major dilemma of our times, at least in this country. May I add one thought to what I said before in reply to your question? Yes. I see as one of the most difficult aspects of this problem the trouble that the individual government official has in arriving at an assessment of the reliability of his friends. I have continued to accept as friends some people who have been criticized publicly and on whose reliability some suspicion has been thrown publicly in this country, because I myself have never seen yet the proof that those charges were correct, and have not considered myself in a position to arrive at a negative judgment about this. I have felt that until it is demonstrated to me that people who are friends of mine really have been guilty of some genuine dereliction of their duty to the government, or their loyalty to the government, it is not for me to jump to conclusions about it, and out of a timidity lest my name be affected with theirs, to cut off social relations with them. I must say, when it is demonstrated to me that anyone has been so derelict, then I have no desire to continue the friendship or the association, and especially if I were in government service, I would consider it quite out of the question. But there have been many instances in which one has been torn between the fact that doubts have been raised, but proof has not been given. There, I feel that the burden of proof so far as one's relations with one's friends is concerned is on the accuser, unless it is demonstrated to me that my friend in some way offended against the law or against his governmental duty. I am slow to drop my friend myself. And I think that's a pretty fair standard that's being laid down here, which I think is a pretty good defense for Oppenheimer of his past associations, which is it's ridiculous to judge someone as being disloyal because their associations are highly suspect. If those associations haven't actually been convicted of a crime, right? In all of this derogatory information against Oppenheimer, none of the people that he associated with were convicted of a crime, at least at the time that Oppenheimer was associated with them. A few of them might have gone on to be convicted of crimes. None of them in particular stick out to me. But, how are you as an individual who doesn't have all the information that a judge or a jury might have, how are you individually supposed to judge every single person that comes your way, right? So I think that's a pretty solid defense right there. I would like to move back to the question of your attitudes toward the development of the hydrogen bomb in the period before the president's decision to proceed in January of 1950. Had you been told, Mr. Kennan, in 1949, for example, by a scientist whose judgment and capability you respected, that it was probable that a thermonuclear weapon could be developed, which would be more economical in terms of the use of material and cost and the rest of it than the equivalent number of atom bombs, would you have then been in favor of developing the hydrogen bomb? I would not have favored developing it, at least until a real decision had been made in this government about the role which atomic weapons were to play generally in its arsenal of weapons. I would have had great doubts then about the soundness of doing it. That comes from philosophic considerations, partly, which I exposed to the Secretary of State, which did not, I might say, meet with his agreement or with that of most of my colleagues, and the future will have to tell. But it seemed to me at the end of this atomic weapons race, if you pursued it to the end, we building all we can build, they building all they can build, stands the dilemma which is the mutually destructive quality of these weapons, and it was very dangerous for us to get our public before the dilemma, that the public mind will not entertain the dilemma, and people will take refuge in irrational and unsuitable ideas as to what to do. For that reason, I have always had the greatest misgivings about the attempt to ensure the security of this country by an unlimited race in the cultivation of these weapons of mass destruction, and have felt that the best we could do in a world where no total security is possible is to hold just enough of these things to make it a very foolish thing for the Russians or anybody else to try to use them against us. So you would have been in favor of stopping production of the A-bomb after we had reached a certain point with respect to the stockpile. That is correct. Whatever that might have been. No, and I didn't consider myself competent to determine exactly what that point was. I've never known the number of our bombs, nor the real facts of their destructiveness, or any of those things. Knowing the Russians as you do, perhaps as well as any American, would you have expected them to continue to improve whatever weapons they may have within limitations of economy, scientific availability, and so forth? My estimate is that they would have cultivated these weapons themselves primarily for the purpose of seeing that they were not used, and would have continued to lay their greatest hopes for the expansion of their power on the police weapons, the capacity to absorb continuous areas, and on the conventional armaments as a means of intimidating other people and perhaps fighting if they have to fight. I have one final question. Were you opposed to the use of the atom bomb? I knew nothing about it, sir, until I read it actually in the Soviet papers in Moscow, that it had been used. You were in Moscow? I was in Moscow at the time, and therefore could not look at it. I could look at it only retrospectively. I must say that personally I'm not at all sure that we were well advised to use it. I have great fears of these things. Do you think we perhaps were ill-advised to develop it? No, that I don't think. I said I had just one question, and I am sorry I'm going to ask you another. The atom bomb was many times as powerful as any explosive we had prior to its development. The same is true, I suppose, of the H-bomb. I don't know what the geometric progressive relationship would be, but that is unimportant. You had a serious question about proceeding with the hydrogen bomb. No question that we should have done what we did with respect to the development of the atom bomb. Is the different attitude on this due to the fact that perhaps an atom bomb, properly placed, could take care of a target, and that a larger bomb would be unnecessarily large? Is it size? Is that the distinction you make? Is it because the civilian population may be involved more deeply? It's because of the wonder on my part as to whether we did not already have enough of this sort of terrible ability to commit destruction. At least I had not seen it proven to me that we needed more, perhaps. Perhaps there again, with some of us civilians, it becomes hard for us to absorb the mathematics of destruction involved in these things. To my mind, the regular old bomb made a big enough bang, and as big as anybody could want. I found it difficult. You see, what has worried me, Mr. Chairman, about going ahead with this is that we would come to think of our security as embraced solely in the mathematics of whatever power of destruction we could evolve, and we would forget our security lies still very largely in our ability to address ourselves to the positive and constructive problems of world affairs, to create confidence in other people. I'm convinced that the best way to keep our allies around us is not to pay outwardly too much attention to the atomic weapons and to the prospect of war, but to come forward ourselves with plans that envisage the constructive and peaceful progress of humanity. I realize that while we do that, we have to preserve an extremely alert and powerful defense posture at all times, but I believe in preserving that posture to the maximum and talking about it to the minimum, and then limiting ourselves in our foreign policy primarily to the constructive rather than the negative objectives. I have feared that if we get launched on a program that says the only thing we are concerned to do in the development of atomic weapons is to get as much as possible as rapidly as possible, that the attentions of the public and the government will become riveted to that task at the expense of our ability to conduct ourselves profitably in positive aspects of foreign policy. That has been the nature of my worry. I have never felt a great degree of certainty about this, and I have always realized it was a very difficult problem, but it did seem to me at that time, and it seems to me still in retrospect, that one could doubt the desirability of going ahead with this weapon then from motives which were very serious and respectable motives. In other words, one could doubt it out of a devotion to the interests of our country. At least I feel that I did. Very often today, when I read the papers, it seems to me that some of the things I feared at that time are beginning to develop in some degree. Okay, I see we have some chat, so I will respond to the chat. Let's see. Okay, first we have Shabit Singh says, say something about Oppenheimer views on Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, so that's where the famous quote, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," comes from, and that is, the Hindu scripture. Let me think about that for a second. I mean, it was referenced pretty heavily in the movie. It was like, well, okay, so something interesting is that Oppenheimer was a very academic and scholarly guy, so he would read a lot of different, vastly different ideological books in all different languages. He liked learning a bunch of languages. And so it is sort of interesting because you have that image of a sort of Renaissance man where, this is someone that is very skilled in their field, but also knows a lot about a lot of other things. Whereas today, I think there's a lot more hyper-focus in the sciences. And I think it's healthy and pretty good to have an understanding of a bunch of different philosophy as well. So, yeah, I don't know as much about the Bhagavad Gita specifically, but yeah. Okay, so let's see. Continuing, we have CDP asks, a personal question. Having a background in physics and after everything you've read, would you have joined the Manhattan Project now knowing its end result? So that's an interesting question. So yeah, I'm studying physics. I'm majoring in physics, and that is a good question. because the use of the atom bomb has always been it's always been a bit of a moral dilemma, because the theory was that using the atom bomb saved many soldier and civilian casualties that would have otherwise been used in World War II. But since then, the atomic bomb has just been this great risk of sort of descending the world into catastrophic chaos. And the idea might have been like, oh, there would have been, like at first it was, having this as a negotiating chip is going to guarantee peace because no one's going to want to go to war anymore because it's too destructive, which funnily enough has been the inciting principle behind the development of a lot of weapons. Like I believe the machine gun, the developer of the machine gun thought, well, this is going to make war so destructive that no one's going to want to go to war again. But no, they just went to war with machine guns. The inventor of, I think it was Eli Whitney, of guns that could be factory produced rather than hand produced, he was like, oh, this will make war so deadly that no one will want to go to war again. So it just never works. There is no weapon that's too big for people to not ever go to war again. But it is pretty interesting that atomic bombs have not been used since World War II, which is pretty fascinating. And I think that's because of their increasing destructive capacity. So it is interesting whether I personally would have joined the Manhattan Project knowing the result today. I'd like to think no, just because in the grander picture how deadly it was, but the problem is it was essentially a race between the US and Germany, Nazi Germany at the time. And so the question is, who do you want to have it, Nazi Germany or America? And I would rather that America have it. But, the problem is that it doesn't really matter much whether, one person joins the project or not, because obviously it got done anyway, right? I mean, if it got done without me back then me joining or not would not have made a difference back then. But, yeah, I don't know. I think the development of nuclear weapons was always an inevitability, personally, just because people always figure out new technology. Technology does not stop. If you don't invent it, someone else will. But yeah, it is really interesting the sort of effects that has had on the world that we have to deal with today, which is just this, it's mostly risk is the effect, because again, they haven't been used in such a long time. But anyway, let's see. Next question, we have CDP says, but also knowing the cutting edge and unprecedented science that was being developed at Los Alamos. Right, exactly, because there was also, a bunch of other benefits to the Manhattan Project, like the development of nuclear energy, which I am strongly in favor of because it statistically is much safer than other forms of energy, particularly fossil fuels. It's very hard to quantify the dangers of fossil fuels because it's more of a global effect, whereas nuclear accidents are highly localized whenever they happen. But I've always conceptualized it as the difference between a car crash and an airplane accident. You're much more likely to die in a car crash than you are in a plane crash, but which is more likely to make the news? The plane crash. And so people tend to be much more fearful of flying than they are of driving. And I think the same dichotomy occurs between nuclear power and fossil fuels in that one is actually statistically more dangerous, that being fossil fuels, but the other is more spectacularly dangerous in that it's very newsworthy when it goes wrong. So people tend to be more afraid of the latter. But the amount of lives that have been saved just because of the existence of nuclear power is actually greater than the amount of lives lost in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. if you just base that on switching away from fossil fuels to nuclear power. So there was a lot of good that came from this research into nuclear science. And my hope is just that in the future, it continues to be put to good use rather than bad use. So that's the idea. Again, these are all sort of like very difficult ethical questions, and they're hard to answer and also hard to quantify, because sometimes you have to like ask what would have happened in these different scenarios. But anyway, we have a comment from Nick Marcanton, says hey, and then T.O. says hey. Nick says, what is this live about? So this live stream is about the Oppenheimer Security Hearings that 1/3 of the Christopher Nolan movie was based on. So all of the scenes that occurred in the like small government office room where Oppenheimer was being questioned by various people about his time in the Manhattan Project. This served as the sort of middle period, because the Christopher Nolan movie was divided into basically sections about Louis Strauss's nomination hearings for the Senate, the actual Manhattan Project itself, and then the third thing was these security hearings, where Oppenheimer has been denied renewal of his security clearance, and he is protesting that and will ultimately unsuccessfully trying to get a security clearance back. So the transcripts of this have been published by the Department of Energy, and I'm just reading through them. Anyway, T.O. says, great answers, by the way. Well, thank you. Okay, so I think that's good. So I'm going to get back to the transcript. All right. Mr. Kennan, there are a couple of questions I want to ask you. You will admit, I suppose, that at one time in his career, Dr. Oppenheimer displayed that he was a rather naive individual. You will admit that, won't you? That, I think, is apparent from the exchange of correspondence that I read in the papers. Now, another question. Because a man has had some communist connections, he might be placed sometimes in an entirely different position in regard to security from a man that had not had those connections would be placed. Is that true? I think that is correct. It appears in a different light. You understand the position that this board is in, don't you? I believe I do, sir. We have to decide on these things in regard to character, associations, and loyalty. This is not a job that any of us sought. You understand that? I do. We didn't want it. I do. I don't want it today. We all know Dr. Oppenheimer's ability. Nobody knows better than I do. This act mentions certain things: character, associations, and loyalty. It doesn't say in there anything about the outstanding ability which is mentioned here so much. You understand that point, don't you? Yes. Perhaps the act ought to be rewritten. I don't know. I just want you to understand the position we are in. It is not a pleasant position. I do, sir. Now, just one other question. You opposed this hydrogen bomb on two grounds: on moral grounds and on the fact that it was so big it would be like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. Is that true? I have never conceived them really as just the moral ground, because I didn't consider that. After all, we are dealing with weapons here, and when you are dealing with weapons, you are dealing with things to kill people, and I don't think the considerations of morality are relevant. I had real worries, sir, about the effects of this on our future policy and suitability of our future policy. That is all. Okay, so then there's going to be redirect examination by Mr. Marks, but I see more chat, so I will... Oh, never mind. But yeah, again, just interesting. That's a pretty funny statement from Dr. Evans there, where he's like, I don't want to do this, please, I'm not up for this. I didn't sign up for this. And Kennan's just like, I know, I get it, but again, I mean, that is a difficult position to be in there. It's like being in the position of judges on a federal court, in that you have to respond specifically about the law. You're not making your decision on vibes, right? Your responsibility is to make decisions about the law based on what's written. It doesn't matter if you don't like the law. Your job is very explicit, and that's essentially the concern that Dr. Evans is posting here. He's saying, I think this is a poorly written law because it is fair what you're saying, Kennan, that if someone is highly talented, there's more reward, hence you're willing to take more risk, right? That tends to be the idea of expected value, right? Is that you're willing to accept a greater risk if there's a greater reward to it, right? But that's not how the law is written. And so to do their duty properly, they can't consider the outstanding capabilities of Dr. Oppenheimer. And so I think that is a big part of what ultimately led to their decision to deny him his security clearance, which they ultimately will deny, because they're like, look, we really respect you. We think that, you're, a great scientist and all that. But based on the letter of the law, we have to do what we have to do, is kind of the feeling. Anyway, I see some more chat. We have CDP asks, did Oppenheimer regret the development of the bomb, in your opinion? Yeah, so that's an interesting question. They asked him about that, I'd say, a few transcripts ago. And his opinion is like, I'd say kind of wishy-washy on that. What Oppenheimer was mostly saying was that, he thought it was necessary. And I don't know, that's hard to say. I don't think he regretted it. I mean, I don't know. It's really hard to know what's in someone's head, but I don't think he regretted it, because if he regretted it, why would he keep working on the U.S. nuclear program after the end of the war, right? Because, if Oppenheimer regretted the building the nuclear bomb, he certainly didn't regret it so strongly as of 1954 or any point before that he felt that he should quit the government service. So, the atomic bombs were dropped in 1945, and for the intervening 9 years, Oppenheimer has been working on helping the U.S. government expand its stockpile of atomic bombs. When the hydrogen bomb program was up for question, at first he said, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think we should do it. But once the government decided we are doing it, he was like, all right, well, I will put my best effort into that as well. So while Oppenheimer, maybe he regretted it, but he certainly didn't regret it enough to stop, helping out. Perhaps he thought that he could have a greater influence on international policy, and that, outweighed the negatives of continuing to develop the bombs. But, it's not like this was the only, choice of career he could do. He could go be a professor somewhere and just teach about theoretical physics or something like that, right? So he wanted to continue this work in weapons development. And you could say maybe to influence policy. But if you look at his actions, once a policy was decided, he would go along with it. So I don't know. I tend to think that he didn't really regret it. Maybe when he was older, like in the 1960s, in the I forget how long he lived, I think 1967. So in the 10 years after he gets his security clearance taken away, maybe he did begin to regret it, but at least at this point, I don't think he really regretted it. Maybe he's beginning to regret it as these hearings go on, but anyway. Okay, redirect examination by Mr. Marks. Dr. Kennan, I would like to follow up briefly the question that you were asked by Dr. Evans about the problem which this board faces and the test it has to apply in discharging its rather awesome responsibility is one in which it has to assess, as I read the act, character, associations, and loyalty of the individual. Advise the Commission whether the Commission should determine that permitting the individual to have access to restricted data, a term which I believe you understand, will not endanger the common defense and security. In answer to a question, I think it was addressed to you by the chairman, about the relationship between a case involving a stenographer, Mr. Robb asked you about a case involving a Marine. The natural question also arises whether different standards should apply to an extraordinary individual. I would not suggest to you any question which implied that different standards should apply, but I would like to explore your own views about what standards you had in mind when you said that in relation to gifted individuals, it was common to find that they had unconventional backgrounds, and that therefore, as I understood it, a different type of inquiry was required for evaluation. Could you explain a little bit more fully what you had in mind? It is simply that I sometimes think that the higher types of knowledge and wisdom do not often come without very considerable anguish, and often a very considerable road of error. I think the Church has known that. Had the Church applied to St. Francis the criteria relating solely to his youth, it would not have been able for him to be what he was later. In other words, I think very often it is in the life of the Spirit, it is only the great sinners who become the great saints, and in the life of the government, there can be applied the analogy. I have often said it is the people who have come to their views through the questioning of other things who have the highest and firmest type of understanding in the interests of government. At any rate, it seems to me that the exception people are often apt not to fit into any categories of requirements that it is easy to write into an act or a series of loyalty regulations. I feel that one ought to bear that in mind. I realize the problem for the government as to how it is to do it, and technically, it is not always easy. It is a dangerous thing to talk exceptions because nobody can define again by category who is an exceptionally gifted person and who is not. The attempt is often invidious and involves the creation of an invidious distinction. I'm not sure it can be formalized, but I have always felt that the US government has to realize that it has a real problem here, particularly with the people who have the greater capacities. There is need here for considerable flexibility, and as I say at the outset, I think for a looking at the man as a whole and viewing his entire personality, and not judging portions of it. I'm afraid that may not be a very clear answer to what you asked. And yeah, that's interesting right there, because very smart people, like historically, also have tended to be eccentrics of one kind or another. Isaac Newton was very, very antisocial, and like he basically, he invented calculus for his own personal work on physics and didn't tell anyone about it for like 10 years until a friend, I think it was Haley of Haley's Comet fame, who, asked him about it. So it's like you have very eccentric people often end up in these high positions, and I'd say Oppenheimer is likely not an exception. So it does make sense to apply a little grace, especially when the benefits of having them as part of your program are so great because of just the great utility that they provide. Many people would say, Mr. Kennan, that you are a gifted individual. I know of nothing to suggest that you came to the government and remained in it for so many long years of great service as the result of any unconventional background. How do you reconcile those things? I consider myself to be a fortunate man. At the age of 23, at a time when many American young people of good education were drifting into what I think was an unsound approach to life, I was sent out to the Baltic states. I saw the square where the Bolshevik commissars had only recently been shooting their hostages. I saw the building on Elizabeth Street, in the cellar of which they had done their torturing. I was affected from the beginning by a sense of the grotesque injustice of taking a whole class as they did, the bourgeoisie of these countries, and punishing them just because they were classifiable as bourgeoisie. I must say I was so affected by what I saw of the cruelty of Soviet power that I never could receive any of its boasts about social improvement with anything other than skepticism. I think that experience helped me a great deal at an early date, and helped me to avoid mistakes that I might otherwise have made. Later, it fell to me very deeply in Russian literature and German literature, and I have had to go through all that. It has developed in me, as I think in long foreign residence it does. I was abroad 18 years, and a deep acquaintanceship with the thinking of other people. It has involved me sometimes in conflict when I come home. I find myself tending to be critical sometimes of conditions in our country more than other people are, and it's a thing which I have had to fight within myself. Probably what you can say in reply to your question is that I have been lucky in the first place, and secondly, I have been able to conceal the difficulties on the intellectual road I have gone more than other people have been able to keep them within myself and fight them out myself. Let us leave you out of it. Yes. Do I understand what you have been saying is that in your experience, more frequently than not, the extraordinarily gifted individual realizes the fulfillment of his potential as a result of background that has involved many unconventional elements? I think it is often that you get that. I must say that when people are really gifted, those who have what you might call genius of some sort, intellectual or artistic, it is hard for them to arrange their relationships to live in minor matters and in a manner which is wholly conventional. I think we have seen that all through time. Again, I would like to emphasize I do not underrate the seriousness of the problem that it poses for the government when these people are used for government work, but I think it is a problem that should be regarded as such. Mr. Kennan, you have been asked questions in a framework that implies at least that they are addressed to you by the board in the light of the rigorous requirements of the Atomic Energy Act. I hope I'm not out of order in saying that as a lawyer, I cannot believe that the Atomic Energy Act intended to deny to the Atomic Energy Commission the services of gifted people. I ask you to consider, in the light of that statement, this question. In your opinion, and based on all of the experience which you have described here this morning, are the character, associations, and loyalty of Dr. Oppenheimer such as to bring you to a determination that permitting him to have access to restricted data will not endanger the common defense and security? Mr. Marks, I cannot anticipate, of course, the judgment of this board, and the same information is not available to me as is available to the board. I would consider my own opinion one not founded as well as will be the opinion of the board. I can only judge on the basis of what I have seen, which is a portion of the evidence. Of course. On that basis, I may say that I myself have no doubt whatsoever about this, and on the basis of what I know, I would be entirely in favor. I think it flows from what I have said here earlier. I have forgotten how your question was worded. Could we have it read back? Question read by the reporter. May I then simply rephrase my answer from the beginning here and ask that it be regarded as the answer to this question? On the basis of what is known to me of Dr. Oppenheimer's qualities, his personality, and his activities during the period that I have known him, I would know of no reason why he should not be permitted to have access to restricted data in the government. Okay, so now we enter recross examination by Mr. Robb. Mr. Kennan, I gather that you say, and I think quite properly, that of course you don't know what information may be available to the board. Quite so. Of course. You would agree there might be things known to the board which, if known to you, would change your answer to the question. Certainly. Mr. Kennan, we have discussed somewhat the criteria, and so on, of these security procedures and tests. In a case where the question of individual security clearance was involved, assume that the evidence was more or less in equipoise. Who do you think ought to have the benefit of the doubt, the individual or the government? I think unquestionably, sir, the government should have the benefit of the doubt. In saying that, if I may just say so, I'm animated by the reflection that the government's interest might also be torn, that the government might have need of a man, and that interest should also be recognized. I'm not saying to you, sir, that the evidence here is in equipoise. I'm just assuming that. I understand. Mr. Kennan, I would like to ask you another question in your role as an expert on diplomacy, which I perhaps should have asked you before. What, in your opinion, would be the effect and would have been the effect in 1950 on our allies if the Russians had had the thermonuclear weapon and we had not? Do I make myself clear, sir? Yes, sir. I imagine that it might, to some extent, have been an unfortunate one. I do not think decisively unfortunate. I think it would have depended on what we might have been able to say to them about the adequacies of our existing stockpile of atomic weapons. Would you tell us what you mean by unfortunate? Unless we were able to demonstrate to them that what we already held in the way of atomic weapons was sufficient to make it most unlikely that even the Russian hydrogen bomb would be used against ourselves or our allies, then I would consider that the effect on our allies might have been unfortunate, but I would remember that the allies have never been, it seems to me, as conscious of the importance of atomic weapons as we have. Putting it again in the language of the well-known man of the street, if the Russians had had the thermonuclear weapon and we had not, the result might have been that some, at least, of our allies would have been scared off from us. Is that right? Yes, sir. That is certainly one of the considerations that would have had to be taken into account in deciding whether to go ahead with the weapon or not. Mr. Kennan, you mentioned, I don't recall the exact language you used, but I think the substance of it was that there were some friends of yours that you suspended until their guilt was proven, or something of that sort. Yes. Would you mind telling us who you had in mind? A number of my colleagues in the Foreign Service have had the experience of seeing charges or insinuations advanced against them in the public print here, and of having to face congressional charges or congressional investigations of one sort or another. That is the only point I wish to make. I have not done anything to terminate my associations with those men just on the basis of the fact that the charges were raised against them. I have waited to see whether anything would be proven. I prefer to give my friend the benefit of the doubt until something was. Have there been some in respect of whom the charges have been proven? There have been 2 who have left the Department of State, 2 or 3, but I'm not sure that charges were proven. I really would have to ransack my memory to recall exactly the way these cases went. I believe they all left in an honorable way. Doubts were raised, and their names were mentioned publicly. You had faith in them? In every case that I have in mind here, I have had, at least I have never seen the evidence that these men were not loyal government servants, and in the absence of that evidence, I tried not to jump to any conclusion. Now, would you mind telling us who they were? Mr. Chairman, I think it is an unfair question to ask this witness to discuss other people in the government, and I don't see what possible relevance it can have to the inquiry of this board. Mr. Chairman, I asked the witness if he would mind. That is why I asked him that way. The witness certainly would be given the privilege of declining to answer this question if he wishes, without any significance being attached to it. Mr. Chairman, if at any time the board feels the need for the names of these people, I would be very happy to give it. But otherwise, I think at the present time I would prefer not to mention them. The names are fairly well-known ones. May I ask you this, sir, and certainly this gentleman has been much mentioned in the public press. Mr. Chairman, I really object to this. I see this proceeding into a line of questioning, which by some form of suggestion as to names of people who have been adversely discussed in the press, being brought in here with some suggestion that this somehow is connected with Dr. Oppenheimer. I make this observation, Mr. Garrison, that the testimony of a witness which has been given with clarity and conviction, and I think rather eloquently, is based, as I understand it, on his own subjective judgment with respect to the character, loyalty, and associations of Dr. Oppenheimer. Is that a fair statement? Yes. I think that if there are cases or similar situations in which the judgment of the witness has proven not to be borne out by the facts, that it is pertinent to this inquiry. I withdraw the objection, Mr. Chairman. I want to make it clear that I'm sure that the board does not wish a lot of names brought in here by the heels. Oh no. I don't interpret that to be the point. No, that is exactly the theory I put the question to. Was Owen Lattimore one of your associates or friends? No, he was not. I never had any personal acquaintance with him. He would not be one that you included. No, he would not be included. The men I had in mind were associates of mine in the Foreign Service, and one in particular who has been in a number of Congressional and Loyalty Board hearings. I have testified in those hearings as I have in this one. So far to my knowledge, he has never been found guilty by any board or formal branch of an agency of the government of anything reprehensible to him. I have continued to see him and know him as a friend. Were you called as a witness by him, sir? Yes, but if I may say so, initially, over my own objections, because I was then an official of the Department of State, and I felt that the Loyalty Board should ask me as an official for my opinion, feeling that I owed my loyalty entirely to the interest of the government and not to the man as a party in a dispute. Have you testified in any other so-called loyalty hearing? Yes, I testified in one. Again, it was the case of a Foreign Service officer who asked me to testify in his behalf and to read 1,200 pages of his reports and to tell the board that they did not contain evidence of communist loyalty. I told him that I would prefer, as an official of the Department of State, not to do that at his request, but would be happy to do it at the board's request. He did get a letter from the board asking me to do that. The result is that I had to go through 1,200 pages of material and gave the board an opinion. I'm sure the board here understands the difficulty you had in reading 1,200 pages. That is all I care to ask. Dr. Evans, I believe, has one or two questions. Mr. Kennan, in answer to one of the questions that was asked you, I think you stated in effect, or at least you implied, that all gifted individuals were more or less screwballs. Let me say that they are apt to be, if I may. Would you say that a large percentage of them are? No, sir. I would not say that they are screwball, but I would say that when gifted individuals come to a maturity of judgment which makes them valuable public servants, you are apt to find that the road by which they have approached that has not been as regular as the road by which other people have approached it. It may have had zigzags in it of various sorts. I think it would be borne out in the literature. I believe it was Addison, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that said, quote, "Great wits are near to madness. Close allied and thin partitions do their bounds divide," end quote. Dr. Oppenheimer is smiling. He knows whether I am right or wrong on that. That is all. Mr. Kennan, you certainly would not be prepared to testify that all professors are screwballs, would you? I'm worried about that because it has been brought up 2 or 3 times. I'm getting a little sore about it. One further serious question. These gifted people, about whom there has been a very considerable discussion here, as you say, in many cases arrived at judgments, attitudes, convictions, after all sorts of experience. You feel, however, that the unusual person or gifted person who has traveled perhaps a different road than most other people can at one point reach a stability on the basis of which there can be absolute predictability as to no further excursions. Let me say at a point where there can be sufficient predictability to warrant his being accepted by the government for public service. Thank you very much, Mr. Kennan. We appreciate you being here. And witness excused. So, yeah, that's been pretty interesting so far. I think Kennan's testimony was really insightful. I found it very interesting. Because it is just a fascinating story, because he, has this foreign policy expertise with the Soviet Union. And it is interesting, that last part that they were discussing, which is that if the nuclear weapons are just for retaliation, that you only need like 10 of them for it to be an effective, deterrent. But it is a question of, the allies of your government. So, like the US is trying to court allies all around the world during the Cold War. And you have a lot of countries where they could really go either way, like basically all across the third world. And so the question is, does having a huge nuclear stockpile look impressive to potential allies? And might that bring them towards siding with us? And might falling behind on a nuclear stockpile make, our enemies or our potential allies think, well, they don't have that many nuclear bombs. They must not be very capable, so they don't look like the healthier horse here, so I'm going to go with Russia. Right? Because if you think about it, if you're one of these, smaller countries, you're basically trying to make a bet on which of these two great powers is going to be successful in the long run. Which one is going to come to dominate the world, and which can do more for me? And the nuclear stockpiles here are effectively just demonstrations of military and economic might, saying, look how great we are. We can build thousands and thousands of nuclear bombs. You should join our side. And so that is a very interesting consideration to make there, which is something that I haven't really thought about before in terms of, the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, which is that it's not just about mutually assured destruction. It's about sort of signaling and presenting as the stronger country, which is for third parties, which is just very fascinating. But anyway, I will continue in a moment. All right, let's get back to it. Okay, so all right. We will take a recess, gentlemen. Then there's a brief recess. And then we have the next witness, Mr. Lilienthal, takes the stand. So let me rearrange things. Now, Lilienthal, I believe, was a senator. I'm not sure if he's a senator in 1954 or if he's a former senator at this point, but yeah, he was a senator on the Joint Committee of Atomic Energy. So he's a pretty important guy here. He was basically Oppenheimer's boss for many years after the war because Oppenheimer was serving on the General Advisory Committee, which reported to the Joint Committee. So this will be interesting. Okay. Do you wish to testify under oath? You are not required to do so. Most all witnesses have. I prefer to. Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Okay, so then, you know, the whole swearing in rigmarole, it's the same exact thing every time. You know, do you tell the truth, the whole truth? And then a question of, are you familiar with the perjury statute? Yes, I am familiar with the perjury statute. If you want to talk about classified data, please let us know so that we can have everyone leave. And then please don't go blabbing to the press. So those are the three things that Gray reminds every witness of every time. Anyway. Okay. Let me just skip past that. Okay. So direct examination. This time it's by Mr. Silverman, another of Oppenheimer's lawyers. And again, all these, the only lawyers depicted are the heads of the defense and prosecution, essentially. All just sort of boiled down into one character instead of having like four of them. So, okay, Samuel Silverman, direct examination. Mr. Lilienthal, what is your present occupation? I am in private business in New York City as an advisor on industrial matters to financial and industrial enterprises. I'm also a corporate officer as chairman of the board of the Minerals and Chemical Company. Do you have any government employment or position at this time? I do not. You were formerly chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. I was between late October 1946 and the 15th of February 1950. I think you said at 5 p.m. Yes, at 5 p.m. When did you first meet Dr. Oppenheimer? On the occasion of the bringing together of a board or panel, a board of consultants or panel, by the Department of State in January 1946. That panel was organized under a committee called the Secretary of State's Committee. The purpose of the panel and the directions of the panel were to seek to find some basis for a plan or program for the international control of atomic weapons. There were 5 members of this panel designated, I think, by the Secretary of State, or perhaps by the Undersecretary of State, Mr. Acheson, and Dr. Oppenheimer was one of those panel members. And you were the chairman of the panel. I was the chairman of the panel. The other members were Mr. Harry One, vice president of General Electric Company at that time, Dr. Charles A. Thomas, who was then executive vice president of the Monsanto Chemical Company and now its president, Mr. Chester Berard, then president of the New Jersey Telephone Company, and Dr. Oppenheimer. Will you tell us something of how much contact you had with Dr. Oppenheimer during the work on this panel? The panel was convened and met briefly with the Secretary of State's committee. Perhaps I should indicate the personnel of that committee. This was the first meeting with Dr. Oppenheimer. That committee consisted of Undersecretary Acheson, perhaps Assistant Secretary at that time, John McCloy, General Leslie Groves, President Conant of Harvard, and Dr. Vannevar Bush,
chairman of the Joint Research Board of the Defense Establishment. That meeting with this top committee was briefed, and then this board of consultants virtually lived together for 6 or 7 weeks until we finally presented our report to the committee, which we reported. When you say virtually live together, you mean you spent substantially all the time together. Yes, with the exception of a few breaks, we had committed ourselves to devote all of our time to this problem until we either said we couldn't think of anything useful or came up with a report. This we did, so we worked together here as a group. We traveled about the country, seeing the various atomic energy installations for some of us for the first time, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford, and so on. In this process, of course, we came to know each other quite well. We then came back to Washington and spent a good many days in the process of jointly drafting our report. Was Dr. Oppenheimer active in this work? Yes, he was indeed. Would you tell us something about the positions that Dr. Oppenheimer took and the work he did in the drafting of that report, particularly as it bears on his attitude toward the problem presented by our relations with Russia? I think the theme of this group, in which Dr. Oppenheimer's views contributed substantially, was that we should try to absorb the facts about atomic energy and see if we could not come up with some practical, we hoped, and workable and acceptable system of control and protection for the United States and for the world. So Dr. Oppenheimer's approach, as the rest of us, was first to ascertain the facts as a matter of technology and so on. Of course, in that respect, he and Dr. Thomas were really teachers for the rest of us. Then, as to policy, I can recall perhaps a few illustrative instances. Dr. Oppenheimer, and there was unanimity on this, but he certainly probably initiated the idea, and certainly pressed it and elaborated it, which relates to the attitude of Russia and Soviet communism. The first idea we discussed was that of international inspection of countries in the United Nations to see whether they were carrying on atomic weapon enterprises. This we rejected, and an important part of our reasoning for rejecting it was that it was not a foolproof method. Something more than inspection would be necessary, that without international ownership and control of the raw materials and the operations in the atomic energy field, the United States could not trust the Russians merely by inspection to comply with the requirements of the scheme. The actual development of this idea, that inspection was inadequate to protect ourselves from the Russians, or was inadequate idea to go before the world with, the protection of the world was largely formulated by Dr. Oppenheimer and technical associates of his like Dr. Bacher, who had studied the physical problem of the case with which of the ease with which inspection could be avoided by an operating organization in Russia, as distinguished from having a United Nations operating and management team running the plant. That periodic inspection was not a foolproof system. And yeah, that makes sense, because it's like, how do you inspect that nowhere in the entire country of Russia, the largest country in the world, how do you make sure that there's no secret weapons plant somewhere without touring the entire country, which would just be impossible? Like, how do you know that in the middle of Siberia there's not like a secret testing plant? No amount of inspections can really do that. The only way to detect that is through indirect means, so, seismometers, radiation counts, that sort of thing. And now satellite imagery. But back then, they didn't have satellites, and so they would have to go in person to do these inspections. And so what would they really be inspecting? I guess like the major plants, but how do they know that there's not, facilities within the plants that they're not being shown, or that there aren't just whole additional plants that they don't know about? So that's a very hard thing to do. But at the same time, trying to propose an international control of the materials going into atomic bombs also sounds pretty difficult, because, uranium is just another mineral that can be mined in many places around the world, and a lot of them are in Russia. So how are you going to make sure that it's not developed. So yeah, it's a very, very hard problem here, is the international control. Even nowadays, like the best ways to make sure that, like the best ways that we can tell that another country is doing nuclear testing is through, seismometer data. We can see, missile silos from satellites, and we can detect radiation in like the jet stream and stuff like that. But other than that, like if some country was, I don't know, building a nuclear bomb underground and they never tested it, there wouldn't really be much that we could do to figure that out, other than like trying to say, oh, you're buying, too much uranium, but then they could say, oh, well, we have a, nuclear power plant or something. There's ways of hiding it even now, but especially back then when they didn't have as much technology. And so that is just a huge concern for international control. It just makes it that it's just a very frightening prospect, because one of the interesting things about technological development in economics is that as time moves forwards, expensive cutting-edge military technology tends to become less expensive, tends to enter into, business, and then becomes even less expensive, tends to enter personal use, and then becomes even less expensive, and everyone has it. So if you look at the internet, started as a military project, then some businesses started using it, and then everyone's using it. Telephones, or cellular phones. I'm not sure if it was a military project, but computers, all these sort of technological innovations get less expensive with time. And so obviously no one's going down to the department store to buy a nuclear bomb. But what is concerning is that whereas before nuclear weapons were something that only the world's superpowers could build, today most countries could probably build nuclear weapons. I mean, maybe not most, but most mid-sized countries. I mean, that's why we have such concerns over Iran and North Korea developing nuclear weapons and using them, because these are not incredibly powerful nations. These are not massive players in the world. These are regional powers, right? Where you have, superpowers, global, I forget, it's like superpowers, great powers, then regional powers, and minor powers, right? And so you have these regional powers that are able to get their hands on nuclear weapons, and that's just because it's getting easier and more economical to make nuclear weapons in the natural progression of any sort of technology, in that the more that it's made, the easier it is to make more of them. So that is a concern. How do you deal with that going forward in the future? Now it's really just an arms race of detection mechanisms and control mechanisms versus the natural progression of technology making things easier and easier. But anyway, in your view, was the report of that panel one that was reasonably soft, or what have you in respect to the hope of cooperation, or with respect to what one could expect from the Russians? We tried to make it as nearly foolproof as we could. There was early discussion that any proposal that a United Nations operating organization should operate a gaseous diffusion plant within Russia would obviously conflict with the Russian views about the Iron Curtain and access of foreigners and so on. The question was raised first by Mr. Wynne as to whether it made any sense to make a proposal which we were pretty sure the Russians would reject. We concluded, and I took responsibility for this idea initially, that we should present an idea we could stand for, leaving the question of whether it should be submitted to the Russians with a rather strong likelihood of it being rejected to others. It was our job to develop a workable, foolproof system. Therefore, to answer your question about dominating this, I think we did devise that. I think we did devise what would be called a tough program. This was reviewed later by Mr. Baruch and his associations. They accepted these essentials, and they too were insistent on what Mr. Baruch called a foolproof system, a tough system. And Dr. Oppenheimer was in accord with this tough system. Yes, and contributed a great deal to it. When did you say you became chairman of the AEC? I think it was the 28th of October, 1946. Sometime after you became chairman was the question of Dr. Oppenheimer's past associations and his left-wing activities and so on called to your attention? Yes, it was. Will you tell the circumstances of that, please? The board will recall that there is a kind of grandfather clause in the Atomic Energy Act, by which those who had been cleared under the Manhattan District continued to hold their clearances. I have not looked at this provision for some time, but the effect is to hold their clearances until a re-examination by the FBI was made, and the question is re-examined on the basis of new additional information, or something to that effect. So we had a number of such re-examinations coming to us. I've located the date of March 8th as being the date on which I appeared, give or take a day or so. A call from Mr. Hoover saying he was sending over by special messenger an important file involved in this re-examination. I received this file. I relayed to Dr. Oppenheimer. It contained in it a great deal of information from... I received this file. It related to Dr. Oppenheimer. It contained in it a great deal of information from the Manhattan District, and perhaps some subsequent investigation. I called the commissioners together on the 10th. The day of Mr. Hoover's call appears to be Saturday. In any event, I called the commissioners together on a Monday, March the 10th, in the morning, I believe. The existence of this sort of information I did not know up until that time, and I don't think any of us did, unless perhaps Dr. Bacher did. You say you called the commission together. Who was present at the meeting? My recollection is that all the commissioners were present. This would be Dr. Robert F. Bacher, who was at the Los Alamos Project during the war, Sumner T. Pike, Louis L. Strauss, and Wesley W. Waymack. Will you tell us what happened at that commission meeting? Commission conference would be the best description because it continued for some time. It was very informal. We had this file which I requested all the commissioners to read. It was not necessary to request them to because it was obviously a matter of great interest and importance. Instead of delegating this to someone else, it seemed clear to me that we should do the evaluating, since the responsibility of deciding what should be done, if anything, was ours. So we did begin a reading of this file around the table in my office in the new state building, and then later, as time went on, members would take all or parts of their file to their offices and so on. One of the first things that was observed was that although this file did contain derogatory information going back a number of years, it did not contain any reference, as far as I recall, or at least any significant reference, to the work that Dr. Oppenheimer had done as a public servant. Let me interrupt you for a moment. You have seen the Commission's letter of December 23, 1953, which suspended Dr. Oppenheimer's clearance. I have. So far as you can recall, what is the relationship between the derogatory information contained in that letter and the material that was before you sent to you by Mr. Hoover in 1947? From my careful reading of the Commission's letter and my best recollection of the material in that file, and the charges cover substantially the same body of information, except for the hydrogen bomb stuff, of course. Yes, up to the point of 1947, I suppose. You were saying that you found that the file contained derogatory information, but did not contain affirmative matter, shall we say. It did not contain any information about those who worked with Dr. Oppenheimer in the Manhattan district, so we asked Dr. Vannevar Bush, who we knew had been active in the pre-Manhattan district enterprise, as well as since that time, and Dr. James Conant, both who happened to be in town, to come in and visit us about this file. They expressed themselves about Dr. Oppenheimer and his loyalty and character and associations, and particularly the degree to which he had contributed to the military strength of the United States. I called Secretary Patterson, or someone did, to ask him to request General Groves, under whom Dr. Oppenheimer had served. He asked to be asked to supply a statement about his opinion about Dr. Oppenheimer and the circumstances under which he was selected and kept as director of the laboratory. We discussed this with Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant during that day, and I think into the next day. Did you ask Dr. Bush or Dr. Conant for anything in writing? I don't know whether they volunteered or whether we asked, but certainly they did provide written statements more or less following the line of their oral statements. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to read these and refresh my recollection on them. I take it they are in the files. Does the board have Dr. Bush's letter and Dr. Conant's letter? I am sure we do. They are a part of the files. Was there also a written statement by General Groves? That is already in the record, at page 582 or something like that, unless there is some other written statement I don't know about. I'm asking for information. General Groves' statement was read into the record the other day. Then there was a letter from Secretary Patterson to us on the same subject. That is a part of the file. I wonder if this might not be an appropriate time to read those into the record, sir. Go ahead. I don't have them. The file contains a letter of General Groves which has been read into the record, a letter from Mr. Conant and a letter from Mr. Patterson. I'm sure somewhere in here there is a letter from Mr. Bush. The chairman has it now. It also contains, for your information, when that was received. I'm not sure. The citation which accompanied the Medal for Merit, which was awarded to Dr. Oppenheimer. That, I think, has already been read into the record. I think so, but that is in the file. As I recall, this was on the recommendation of General Groves. I probably had seen it at that time. The Medal for Merit citation apparently was sent to Mr. Lilienthal, and a letter from George M. Elsey, dated 14 March 1947. Did it say who Mr. Elsey was? I can't read it here. Commander USNR. I guess he was secretary or something of the board. If I may, I can identify him. He was in the White House staff, assistant to Clark Clifford. I will read it if you want. Quote, The White House, Washington, 14 March 1947, Memorandum for Mr. Lilienthal. The members of the Medal for Merit Board who recommended to the President in January 1946 that Dr. Oppenheimer be awarded the Medal for Merit were Owen J. Roberts, Chairman, William Knudsen, and Stephen Early. Richmond B. Keach, Administrative Assistant to the President, was Secretary to the Board. General Knudsen has since resigned as a member of the Board and has been succeeded by Chief Justice D. Lawrence Groner of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Mr. Keach, although no longer Administrative Assistant to the President, remains Secretary of the Board. A copy of the executive order and a copy of the regulations governing the Medal for Merit are enclosed. Respectfully, George M. Elsey, Commander, USNR. I would like at this point to read the letters from Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant and Secretary Patterson. I have here the original of the letter from Dr. Bush dated March 11, 1947. The original of the letter from General Groves dated March 27, 1947, which I believe is already in the record. That is already in the record. The original of the letter from Mr. Patterson dated March 25, 1947. The original of the letter from Mr. Conant dated March 29, 1947. I will hand these all to you, sir. Thank you very much. With the permission of the board, excuse me for the interruption. I think we will proceed with the presentation of these letters and then break for lunch. I'm afraid if our experience with other witnesses is any indication, we will probably have to ask you to come back after lunch, Mr. Lilienthal. I would like to express the hope that I would be able to finish today so I can get back to work, but I, of course, will be back after lunch. Then there's some discussion off the record. It is agreed that these letters will go into the record. Mr. Robb has already identified the letters. They will be read into the record. They will be transcribed into the record at this point. The letter of March 11, 1947, on the letterhead of the Joint Research and Development Board to Mr. David E. Lilienthal, Chairman, signed, quote, V. Bush, Chairman, end quote. The letter of March 24, 1947, on the War Department letterhead, already read into the record once, and I see no reason to read that in again. The letter of Robert T. Patterson, Secretary of War, on the Department letterhead, stamped secret, I may say, to Honorable David E. Lilienthal. The letter of March 29, 1947, from Dr. Conant to Mr. Lilienthal. The letters are as follows. Quote, the Joint Research and Development Board, Washington, D.C., March 11, 1947. Mr. David E. Lilienthal, Chairman, Atomic Energy Commission, New War Department Building, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Lilienthal, at our conference yesterday, you asked me to comment concerning Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, and I'm very glad to do so. Dr. Oppenheimer is one of the greatest physicists of this country, or of the world for that matter. Prior to the war, he was on the staff of the University of California and was regarded as leader in the theoretical aspects of atomistics and similar subjects of physics. Shortly after the Army entered into the development of atomic energy, he was given a very important appointment by General Groves. This appointment made him director of the laboratory at Los Alamos, which was in all probability the most important post held by any civilian scientist in connection with the entire effort. General Groves undoubtedly made this appointment after a very careful study of the entire affair from all angles, as this was his custom on important appointments. Subsequent developments made it very clear that no error had been made in this connection, for Dr. Oppenheimer proved himself to be not only a great physicist, but also a man of excellent judgment and a real leader in the entire effort. In fact, it was due to the extraordinary accomplishments of Oppenheimer and his associates that the job was completed on time. Subsequent to the end of the war, Dr. Oppenheimer has had a number of important appointments. He was invited by Secretary Stimson as one of the scientists consulted by the Secretaries of War and Navy in connection with the work of the Interim Committee. He was appointed by the State Department as a member of the board which drew up the plan on which Mr. Baruch based his program. He has recently been appointed by the President as a member of the General Advisory Committee of your organization. I have appointed him a member of the Committee on Atomic Energy of the Joint Research and Development Board. All of this has followed from his extraordinary war record, in which he made a unique and exceedingly important contribution to the success of the war effort of this country. I know him very well, indeed, and I have personally great confidence in his judgment and integrity. Very truly yours, signed, V. Bush, Chairman. And then the next letter, quote, Dear Mr. Lilienthal, in connection with your inquiry about Dr. Oppenheimer, a member of the GAC to the Atomic Energy Commission, I am glad to furnish the following information. It is my understanding that Dr. Oppenheimer is a leading physicist of the world. During the war, he held the key post of director of the Los Alamos Laboratory under the Manhattan District Project, which, as you know, was the enterprise under the War Department responsible for development of the atomic bomb. His performance in that post, under direction of General Groves, was a brilliant success. For his exceptionally meritorious service, he was recommended by General Groves to receive the Medal for Merit in August 1945. This recommendation was approved by Secretary of War Stimson, and the award was made by the Medal of Merit Board appointed by the President. Dr. Oppenheimer was also appointed by the War Department to be a member of the advisory panel of scientists to assist the interim committee designated by Secretary Stimson in May 1945 to recommend policies in regard to the atomic bomb and to suggest legislation concerning atomic energy. I met Dr. Oppenheimer several times in the course of this work and received a most favorable impression of his ability, judgment, character, and devotion to duty. Dr. Oppenheimer was recently appointed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, chairman of the Joint Research and Development Board of the War Department and Navy Department, to be a member of the Committee on Atomic Energy under that board. I am enclosing with this letter a memorandum submitted to me by General Groves relative to the loyalty of Dr. Oppenheimer. In conclusion, I should say that from my knowledge of the work that he has done toward making the atomic bomb a success and in other matters related to atomic energy, I have confidence in his character and loyalty to the United States. Sincerely yours, signed Robert P. Patterson, Secretary of War. Next letter. So from Harvard University, we have, Dear Mr. Lilienthal, I am writing you this letter because I understand certain inquiries have been made in regard to the loyalty of Dr. Oppenheimer. It is quite unnecessary for me to recite in this letter the tremendous contribution to the war effort made by Dr. Oppenheimer. As director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, he carried a heavy responsibility both of a scientific and technical nature, and as an administrator faced with an extremely difficult problem. He fulfilled his duties in an admirable manner. I think it can be said that he is one of the 3 or 4 men whose combination of professional knowledge, hard work, and loyal devotion made possible the development of the bomb in time to end the Japanese War. My first personal acquaintanceship with Dr. Oppenheimer started in the summer of 1941. From then until the present day, I have seen him intimately and discussed with him all manner of questions. During the war, I visited Los Alamos frequently, and in doing so, came to know him very well. Since the war, I have discussed not only atomic energy for industrial and military purposes, but all phases of the international problem of control. Likewise, our conversation has ranged over the whole field of American politics and foreign policy. Therefore, I feel sure that the statements that I make about him are based on an intimate knowledge of the man, his views, and his emotional reactions. I can say without hesitation that there can be absolutely no question of Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty. Furthermore, I can state categorically that, in my opinion, his attitude about the future course of the United States government in matters of high policy is in accordance with the soundest American tradition. He is not sympathetic with the totalitarian regime in Russia, and his attitude towards that nation is, from my point of view, thoroughly sound and hard-headed. Therefore, any rumor that Dr. Oppenheimer is sympathetically inclined toward the communists or towards Russia is an absurdity. As I wrote above, I base this statement on what I consider intimate knowledge of the workings of his mind. At the time of Dr. Oppenheimer's entering the work on atomic energy, I heard that there was some question of his clearance by the security agencies. I understand that was based on his associations prior to 1939 and his left-wing sympathies at that time. I have no knowledge of Dr. Oppenheimer previous to the summer of 1941, but I say unhesitatingly that whatever the record might show as to his political sympathies at that time or his associations, I would not deviate from my present opinion, namely that a more loyal and sound American citizen cannot be found in the whole United States. Very sincerely yours, signed James B. Conant, President. The record will show that the members of the board have read these letters. Each member of the board has read all of these letters. Can you give me an indication, Mr. Silverman, of what length of time your questioning may consume? I'm not going to try to hold you to it. I understand that, sir. All lawyers know that there is no more unreliable answer than that of a lawyer as to how long he is going to take. I would guess that our direct examination will probably consume approximately an hour. I used the word guess in its sharpest meaning. Let us proceed now for 15 minutes and then take a break for lunch. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause there. Because we're reaching the 3-hour mark, and I'm almost at the end of the rental of this study room in the library. So we'll pick up back there in a bit. But yeah, very interesting. I mean, lots and lots and lots of people there to vouch for Dr. Oppenheimer. I mean, that would be like, I don't know, like imagine if like, you know, Bill Nye or like Neil deGrasse Tyson, or I mean, those are more celebrities, but than they are like big contributors to like scientific development. They're more about science communication, the two of them. But you know, just think of any like very public trial. There would be so many people there to vouch for the character of someone this respected. So it makes sense that there's, you know, mountains and mountains and mountains of evidence here. So it is pretty fascinating that ultimately the board decides the other way, but I guess it's sort of this abundance of caution kind of thing, and this sort of bureaucratic kind of reading of the law that Dr. Evans was pointing out, which is that, you know, the law is the law, and so we have to apply it, you know, very strictly. And it's like, you know, I don't think he's a communist, but like, I don't know, what if his judgment is bad, right? Because that's part of it, right? It's he just like, you know, what I'm trying to say is that like the board's decision is ultimately going to be, I don't want to be held responsible if renewing Oppenheimer security clearance ends up causing a bunch of information to get leaked, whether that's because Oppenheimer's actually a communist or if it's because he is like has poor judgment or is indiscreet. If I am in the role of Dr. Evans or Mr. Gray or the third one that never talks, I would be thinking, you know, man, do I want that on me if I recertify him and let him continue to work here? Like, do I want to be responsible for the leaking of nuclear secrets? Especially if the law tells me exactly how to deal with situations like these. Again, it's just another one of these tricky moral dilemmas, but it ends unfortunately for Oppenheimer in that he gets kicked out. But we will continue with this hearing next time. So thank you for watching. Thank you to everyone that left messages in the chat. I very much enjoy responding to your questions, and I will see you all next time. So thank you and goodbye.